Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever heard a sound that shouldn't exist? The question lingers in my mind as I sit alone in my apartment, the soft glow of my computer monitor the only source of light in the room. My name is Daniel Mercer, 32, technical support specialist for a security systems company. Nothing special about me, average height, average build, unremarkable brown hair that's starting to thin at the temples. My colleagues would describe me as reliable but reserved. My neighbors probably wouldn't describe me at all. I prefer it that way. My apartment is on the 14th floor of the Lakeside Towers, an aging concrete structure built in the late 70s, overlooking what real estate agents generously call a water feature but is really just a retention pond. Tonight, like most nights, I'm working late, troubleshooting client security systems remotely. The job suits me, minimal human interaction, predictable problems with logical solutions. But for the past 3 nights, something has disrupted my routine. It always begins the same way. At exactly 3:27 in the morning, my phone receives a text message. No contact information, no recognizable number, just a string of characters that look like programming code followed by GPS coordinates. The first night, I dismissed it as spam. The second night, when the identical message arrived at precisely the same time, my technical curiosity was piqued. I traced the coordinates to an abandoned radio station about 20 miles outside the city. Tonight, I'm waiting. My coffee has gone cold, but I hardly notice as I stare at my phone's blank screen. The room feels unusually chilly despite the heating being on. Outside, a light fog has settled over the city, diffusing the streetlights into hazy orbs. I roll my shoulders, trying to release the tension that has been building there all evening. 3:26. I pick up my phone. 3:27. The screen illuminates with the now familiar message. Except this time, there's something different, an additional line. Signal strength increasing. 7 missing. Locate transmission origin. A cold sensation creeps up my spine that has nothing to do with the room temperature. 7 missing? What does that mean? People? And why am I receiving these messages? I should ignore it. I should delete the message and block the number. I should go to bed and forget about it. Instead, I open my laptop and start researching. The abandoned radio station was shut down in 2008 after a telecommunications conglomerate acquired it. Since then, it's been left to decay, occasionally visited by urban explorers and teenagers looking for a thrill. Nothing in the public records suggests anything unusual. But as I dig deeper into local news archives, something catches my eye. In the past 6 months, there have been 4 unexplained disappearances in the general vicinity of the radio station. The cases seem unrelated: a hiker, a wildlife photographer, a local college student, and most recently, a technician from an internet service provider who was last seen heading to check on equipment near the area. The disappearances weren't connected in the news reporting, spread out as they were over months and attributed to various possible causes from animal attacks to runaways. 4, not 7. But still. A sharp electronic screech from my computer speakers makes me jump. For a moment, the screen flickers, displaying what looks like a fragmented image, a dark corridor, perhaps. It's gone before I can make sense of it. My heart is racing now. I check my system for malware, run diagnostics. Everything appears normal. But the air in the apartment feels different somehow, thicker, charged with something I can't identify. The shadows in the corners of the room seem to have deepened. From somewhere in the building, I hear a faint mechanical hum that doesn't belong to any of the usual ambient sounds. It rises and falls in an irregular pattern, almost like breathing. I've lived here for 3 years and have never noticed it before. I find myself moving to the window, drawn by some inexplicable urge. The fog has grown denser, obscuring most of the view, but as I peer down, I notice a figure standing beside the retention pond, motionless, looking up at the building. At my window? I step back abruptly, nearly tripping over a chair. When I look again, no one is there. The pond surface is still, reflecting the ghostly light of the fog-shrouded street lamps. Sleep. I need sleep, I tell myself. My mind is playing tricks on me, finding patterns where none exist, making connections that aren't real. I close my laptop, silence my phone, and head to bed. But as I lie in the darkness, the hum I noticed earlier grows more pronounced. It seems to be coming from inside the walls now, vibrating through the structure of the building. I place my palm against the cool plaster and feel a subtle tremor. My phone lights up on the nightstand. Another message. Locate origin. Prevent 8. The room temperature drops so suddenly that my breath fogs in front of me. The hum intensifies, becoming a pulsing rhythm that matches my quickening heartbeat. Something is happening. Something that defies the logical, predictable world I've built for myself. Tomorrow, I decide I'll go to the radio station. Not because I believe in mysterious signals or supernatural occurrences, but because I'm a technical specialist. If there's a transmission being sent, I can find its source. I can explain it. I have to explain it. Because the alternative, that something beyond my understanding has reached out specifically to me, is too terrifying to contemplate. The hum finally subsides, and I drift into an uneasy sleep, dreaming of static-filled broadcasts and shadowy figures standing motionless in the fog, their faces turned up toward my window, watching, waiting. The drive to the abandoned radio station feels longer than the 20 miles it actually is. I've called in sick to work, something I never do, and spent the morning gathering equipment, my laptop, signal analyzer, an old ham radio receiver I've kept since college, flashlights, extra batteries. The rational part of my brain insists I'm overreacting to spam texts and coincidences, but something deeper, more primal, knows better. The October sky hangs low and gray, threatening rain. My GPS guides me off the highway onto progressively narrower roads until I'm on little more than a gravel path cutting through dense woodland. The trees press in from both sides, their branches forming a canopy that darkens my surroundings prematurely. My car radio has been acting strangely since I left the city limits, stations cutting in and out, fragments of broadcasts overlapping. Now it emits nothing but static, growing louder as I approach my destination. The station appears suddenly around a bend, a 2-story concrete structure with a rusted broadcast tower rising behind it. Decades of neglect have left the building partially reclaimed by nature. Vines crawl up its walls, windows are shattered, and the main entrance is tagged with faded graffiti. No signs of recent human activity. I park at what was once a small lot, now overgrown with weeds pushing through cracked asphalt. As I step out of the car, the silence is immediate and oppressive. No birdsong, no insect noise, not even the rustle of leaves despite the breeze I can feel on my skin. The static from my car radio continues, audible even with the doors closed and windows up. I check my phone, no service. Expected, given the remote location, but still unsettling. I approach the building cautiously, equipment bags slung over my shoulder. The main entrance is blocked by a collapsed section of roof, so I make my way around to a side door hanging partially off its hinges. Hello? My voice sounds thin in the dead air. Anyone here? No response, but as I step inside, I swear I hear a faint echo that doesn't match my words. The interior is what you'd expect: debris-strewn corridors, water damage, offices emptied of anything valuable long ago. My flashlight beam cuts through the gloom, illuminating dust particles that hang suspended in the air, oddly motionless despite my movement stirring them. I find the main broadcasting room on the first floor. Old equipment sits covered in dust, cables hanging like dead vines. It's been stripped of anything useful, but the basic infrastructure remains: soundproof walls, control panels, phantom outlines where mixing boards once stood. I set up my equipment on what was once the producer's desk. My signal analyzer immediately picks up something unusual, a faint but consistent transmission across multiple frequencies, originating from somewhere in or near the building. The pattern is complex, not random static or interference. Something is broadcasting from here. I follow the signal, moving from room to room with my handheld detector. The strength fluctuates, sometimes fading completely before returning stronger than before. It leads me to a stairwell at the back of the building, its steps descending into darkness beyond what my flashlight can penetrate. There's no basement on the building plans I reviewed. The temperature drops noticeably as I begin my descent. 17 steps down, the stairwell opens into a corridor that shouldn't exist: newer construction, metal walls instead of concrete, no dust or signs of abandonment. Fluorescent lights flicker to life overhead as I enter, triggering automatically. Who's there? I call out, my voice echoing metallically. The corridor extends about 30 feet before ending in a heavy steel door with a keypad lock. The signal is coming from beyond that door, so strong now that my detector is maxing out. My heart pounds in my chest. This is far beyond spam texts or coincidences. This is deliberate, hidden, wrong. A security camera in the corner of the ceiling pivots toward me. Its small red light blinks on. I've been noticed. My phone buzzes in my pocket, impossible, with no service. The screen shows a new message. 8 taken. Time compression initiated. Find the core. The fluorescent lights flicker rapidly, then stabilize at half their previous brightness. A low hum fills the air, identical to what I heard in my apartment. I approach the door, examining the keypad. It's an older model I recognize from work, a 6-digit entry system. On impulse, I enter 327327, the time the messages always arrive. A mechanical click, and the door slides open. Beyond lies a circular room dominated by a central column of equipment rising from floor to ceiling. Servers, processors, cooling systems, but unlike any I've ever seen. The architecture is familiar yet wrong, like technology from an alternate timeline where development took a different path. Screens line the walls, displaying what I first think are security camera feeds, but quickly realize are something else entirely. Each shows a different location, some I recognize from around the city, others completely foreign to me. And in each, a figure stands perfectly still, looking up or outward, just like the figure I saw by the pond. I count the screens. 7. The central column pulses with bluish light, synchronized to the now unmistakable hum. Approaching it, I see what appears to be a control panel with a keyboard unlike any standard layout, symbols instead of letters or numbers. A new screen illuminates above the panel, displaying text. Welcome Operator 9. Previous operators integrated. Signal expansion at 89%. Awaiting final authorization. My mouth goes dry. 8 taken. Operator 9. The missing people weren't random. A sound behind me, footsteps. I spin around, but the doorway is empty. Yet the footsteps continue, crossing the room, unseen but undeniably present. The air shimmers where the sound originates, like heat waves above hot asphalt. Who are you? I manage to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. The shimmering intensifies, coalescing into something almost visible, a human shape, transparent but growing more solid by the second. Features begin to form, a face I recognize with a jolt of horror. It's my face, but not quite. Older, gaunt, eyes hollow. When it speaks, the voice is mine but distorted, as if coming through layers of interference. We are the operators. We maintain the signal. We expand the network. What signal? What network? I back away, bumping into the control panel. Time is non-linear for us now. We exist across multiple points simultaneously. The signal allows this. My doppelganger steps closer. Behind it, I notice more shimmering forms taking shape, 7 more figures emerging from nothing. The equipment, the technology, what is this place? I demand, fighting rising panic. A node. One of many. The signal originates beyond, but we maintain it, strengthen it, expand its reach. Why me? Why the messages? You were selected. Compatible. Technical aptitude combined with isolation patterns. Minimal connection disruption upon integration. The word integration sends ice through my veins. On the screens, I notice the static figures have all turned, now facing directly into their cameras, staring out at me. Their features are becoming clearer, men and women of various ages, including the missing persons I researched. My doppelganger reaches for me, its hand now almost completely solid. Integration is not painful. You will understand once complete. I back away, looking desperately for escape. The door we entered through is sealed shut. The other operators are advancing now, forming a loose circle around me. I don't want to be integrated. My voice rises in panic. Preference is irrelevant. The signal must grow. 9 becomes 10, becomes 100, becomes 1,000. The hum increases to a painful intensity. The blue light pulses faster. On one screen, I see my apartment building, and standing by the pond, looking up at my window, is a new figure. It's me. Right now. Somehow. Time compression, my doppelganger explains, seeing my confusion. Past, present, future, all accessible through the signal. What you see has already happened and is yet to occur. Its hand closes around my wrist. The touch is cold, electrical, sending painful tingles up my arm. The other operators close in, their hands reaching for me. In desperation, I slam my free hand down on the control panel, hitting keys at random. Alarms blare instantly. The blue light turns red. Warning, signal integrity compromised. Containment failure imminent. The operators freeze, expressions shifting from blank calm to something like fear. What have you done? My doppelganger demands, its grip tightening painfully. I don't know, but I seize the opportunity. With strength born of terror, I wrench free and shove past two of the operators, making for a previously hidden door that slid open when the alarms activated. Behind me, chaos erupts. The central column sparks and shudders. The operators move with inhuman speed, trying to stabilize the equipment. My doppelganger turns toward me, its face contorted with rage. Stop him. If he escapes now, the timeline fractures. I run through the new doorway into another corridor, this one sloping upward. The alarms follow me, lights flashing red. The building itself seems to be shaking now, dust and small pieces of ceiling raining down. I can hear footsteps pursuing me, too many sets to count. The corridor branches. I take a random turn, then another. I'm lost, running blindly, the exit nowhere in sight. My phone buzzes again. The message chills me to the bone. Escape impossible. Integration inevitable. The signal finds all. I round a corner and skid to a halt. A dead end. Behind me, the footsteps approach, unhurried now. They know they have me. But in the wall ahead, I notice something, a maintenance panel, large enough for a person. Without thinking, I wrench it open and squeeze through into darkness beyond, pulling it shut behind me. I find myself in a narrow space between walls, pitch black. I turn off my flashlight to avoid detection and hold my breath, listening. The footsteps reach the dead end. Silence. Then, a voice, my voice, but not, speaks so close it must be just on the other side of the panel. It doesn't matter where you hide. The signal is already inside you. You've been receiving it for days. Integration has already begun. As if in confirmation, my phone illuminates in my pocket, casting a ghostly glow in my hiding place. Not a message this time, but an incoming call. The caller ID shows my own number. I reject the call with trembling fingers. The phone immediately rings again. The same number. The voice beyond the panel laughs softly. Answer it. Hear your own voice. Understand what you're becoming. Instead, I turn off the phone completely. The darkness is absolute now. We'll find you, the voice promises. If not here, then later. The signal knows where you live, where you work, where you'll be. Time is on our side. The footsteps recede. They're leaving, confident in their eventual success. I remain motionless, barely breathing, as seconds stretch to minutes. The alarms continue, more distant now. The shaking has subsided to a gentle vibration. After what feels like hours, but might be minutes, I risk turning my flashlight on at its lowest setting and examine my hiding place. It appears to be a maintenance crawlspace, extending in both directions. Choosing randomly, I begin to crawl, hoping to find a way out before the operators return. The signal has already begun my integration, they said. But what does that mean? Will I become like them? Is it too late to stop it? As I crawl through dust and cobwebs, one thought burns in my mind. I need to understand what the signal is and how to silence it before I lose myself completely. The maintenance shaft narrows until I'm forced to wriggle forward on my stomach, flashlight gripped between my teeth. The air grows stale, dust coating my throat with each shallow breath. My elbows and knees are raw from scraping against rough concrete and exposed metal. After what feels like an eternity, I see a faint glow ahead, daylight filtering through a ventilation grate. I push forward with renewed desperation, reaching the grate and pressing my face against it. Outside, I can see trees, the gravel path, a slice of gray sky. Freedom. The grate is held in place by 4 rusted screws. I have nothing to remove them with except my keys, which I use to slowly, painfully work each screw loose, constantly glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see figures crawling toward me through the darkness. The final screw falls away. I push against the grate, which gives with a groan of protesting metal, then tumbles to the ground outside. I squeeze through the opening, scraping my shoulders raw, and fall to the earth below, gasping in clean air. The radio station looks different from the outside now, more intact, less overgrown. The broadcast tower pulses with the same blue light I saw in the underground chamber. No, not the same. This is happening now, not a memory or hallucination. Whatever I did by hitting those controls has affected the entire facility. I need to get away. I stumble toward where I park my car, only to find the lot empty. Not just my car missing, the lot itself is different, freshly paved, without the weeds and cracks I noticed earlier. A terrible suspicion forms in my mind. I turn back toward the building, studying it more carefully. The graffiti is gone. The windows are intact. A sign I hadn't noticed before identifies it as KBHR Communications, private property, no trespassing. This isn't the abandoned station I drove to. Or rather, it is, but not in the same time. My phone. I need to check the date. I pull it from my pocket with shaking hands and press the power button. It comes to life immediately, no longer turned off as I'd left it. The date displayed confirms my fear, June 12, 2008. Months before the station was officially shut down. I've been moved backward in time. No, not just moved, this isn't simple time travel. The operators said time was non-linear for them, that they existed across multiple points simultaneously. Somehow, I've been shifted to another point in their network. A car approaches along the gravel path, a security patrol vehicle, slow and deliberate. I duck behind a cluster of bushes, heart hammering. The car rolls past my hiding spot and parks near the main entrance. A guard gets out, middle-aged and bored-looking, making his routine checks. I need to get back to my time, my reality. But how? The only technology capable of manipulating time is inside the building I just escaped. As I crouch in the undergrowth, debating my options, my phone buzzes. I stare at it in disbelief. There shouldn't be service here, especially not 16 years in the past. But there on the screen is a new message. Temporal displacement successful. Integration proceeding on multiple timelines. Return to core for completion. Return to the core. Back inside, back to those operators with their hollow eyes and cold, electrical touch. The thought makes me physically ill. But what choice do I have? I'm stranded in the past, and the only way home is through the same technology that brought me here. I wait until the security guard completes his rounds and drives away before approaching the building again. This version of the station is active, operational. I can hear the hum of equipment, see lights in the windows. Entering undetected will be challenging. After circling the perimeter, I find a fire exit with a malfunctioning alarm. The connection is visibly damaged. I force the door open and slip inside, finding myself in a corridor much like the one I fled through, but clean, maintained, populated with normal office furniture. I move cautiously, ducking into empty rooms whenever I hear voices or footsteps. This is a functioning radio station, with staff going about their regular duties, completely unaware of what lurks beneath them or what their workplace will become. Following the same path I took earlier, in the future, I locate the stairwell at the back of the building. It's locked now, a keypad beside it requiring a code for access. I try 327 again, but a red light flashes. Incorrect. Voices approach. I hide in a nearby storage closet, heart pounding. Through the partially open door, I watch as two men in suits stop by the stairwell. One enters a code. I strain to see the numbers, 061208. Today's date. The door unlocks with a soft beep, and they disappear down the stairwell. I count to 30 before following, easing the heavy door open and descending the stairs as quietly as possible. The corridor below is different, brightly lit, newly constructed. Armed guards stand at intervals, but they seem to be looking outward, as if expecting threats from the stairwell, not from within. I can't just walk past them. I need a distraction. My phone buzzes again. Another message. Convergence imminent. All operators prepare. As if responding to the message, alarms suddenly blare throughout the facility. Red lights flash. The guards shout to each other and run toward the stairwell, rushing past my hiding place without noticing me. I don't question my luck. I sprint down the now unguarded corridor toward the steel door at the end. It stands partially open, emergency protocols having overridden the security. The circular room beyond is a hive of activity. Scientists and technicians surround the central column, smaller now, less developed, but recognizably the same technology. No operators in sight, just normal humans, panicking as systems malfunction around them. On screens around the room, I see temporal distortions, images flickering between past, present, and what must be future. Fragmentary glimpses of events yet to occur. In one, I see myself entering my apartment building. In another, the radio station in ruins. In a third, something so alien I can't comprehend it, structures that seem to fold in on themselves in impossible geometries. At the center of the chaos stands a man I assume to be the project leader, shouting orders as technicians frantically work to stabilize the column. He turns, and I freeze in shock. It's me. Not the gaunt, hollow-eyed version from before, but me exactly as I am now. Or rather, I am him exactly as he was then. Our eyes meet across the room. Recognition flashes in my face, followed by understanding, then terror. Lock it down, I shouts. Interdimensional breach. The prototype is connected with its future state. Guards appear from side doors I hadn't noticed. I duck behind equipment, moving around the perimeter of the room toward the central column. Whatever is happening, whatever the signal truly is, it centers on that technology. My past self continues shouting, the signal is resonating across temporal dimensions. If it stabilizes, the integration will be permanent. Integration. The same term the operators used. But what does it mean? As if in answer, one of the screens changes, showing a clean, sterile room where a body lies on an examination table, covered with electrodes and monitoring equipment. The face is obscured, but I somehow know with certainty that it's one of the missing persons. Another screen shows a similar scene, but the body is now connected to technology resembling the central column, cables and tubes merging flesh with machine. A third screen shows the integration complete, a human form transformed into something that only superficially resembles a person, their consciousness absorbed into the network, becoming an operator. That's the fate that awaits me. That awaits everyone if the signal expands as intended. I reach the central column undetected during the confusion. Up close, I can see its experimental technology, cobbled together with both familiar and utterly alien components. At its base is what must be the core, a pulsing sphere of energy contained within a transparent chamber, neither solid nor liquid nor gas, but something that seems to exist between states of matter. This is it. The source of the signal. The technology that bridges time and dimension, that turns humans into nodes in its network. My past self spots me. Don't touch it. You don't understand what you're doing. But I do understand more than he possibly can. I've seen the future of his project, seen what it becomes, what it does to people, what it will do to me. Guards are closing in. I have seconds at most. My phone buzzes one final time. Integration failure not an option. The signal must continue. I look up at my past self, who is now rushing toward me, face contorted with panic. You'll collapse the temporal field. You'll destroy everything. I know, I reply calmly. And I smash my phone directly into the core. The effect is instantaneous and catastrophic. The sphere ruptures, energy lashing out in all directions. The column explodes in a shower of sparks and fragmented metal. Screens shatter. People scream. Time itself seems to fracture. I see multiple realities overlapping, the past, present, and futures that might have been, all collapsing into one another. My past self disintegrates before my eyes, molecular structure unable to exist simultaneously with its future version. The operators appear suddenly, materializing throughout the room, their forms unstable, flickering. My doppelganger reaches for me, its face a mask of fury. What have you done? The network is collapsing. The signal cannot be maintained. That's the point, I say, as reality warps around us. No more signals. No more operators. No more integration. The facility begins to tear itself apart, walls buckling as temporal energies surge uncontrolled. The operators scatter into particles, their existence dependent on the network that's now failing. My doppelganger's hand closes around my throat, surprisingly solid. If the signal dies, you die with it. You're already part of it, more than you know. I feel it then, a connection inside me, a resonance with the technology I've destroyed. He's right. I've been receiving the signal for days. The integration had already begun. As the world dissolves around us, my doppelganger smiles. See you in the next cycle. Then everything goes white. I wake up in my apartment, gasping, drenched in sweat. My phone shows 3:20 a.m. For a moment, I believe it was all a nightmare, the messages, the radio station, the operators. Then I noticed something wrong with my reflection in the darkened computer monitor. My face, but not quite right. My eyes, slightly too hollow. My smile, not entirely under my control. I check my phone. No mysterious messages. I go to the window. No figure stands by the pond. Everything appears normal. But the hum is there, faint but unmistakable, coming from somewhere inside me now. When I close my eyes, I see fragments of other times, other places, glimpses of realities that no longer exist or haven't happened yet. I survived, but at what cost? The signal is gone, but echoes of it remain within me. I destroyed the network in that timeline, but how many others exist? How many versions of me are fighting this same battle across dimensions? I pick up my phone and open a new message. I enter a string of seemingly random characters, followed by GPS coordinates for an abandoned radio station. I don't know why I'm doing this, only that I must. Some part of me that isn't entirely me anymore needs to send this warning. I set the delivery time for 3:27 a.m. tomorrow night. To a recipient I've never contacted before, but whose number I somehow know by heart. The signal must continue. But this time, maybe the outcome will be different. How far would you go to uncover the truth if you knew it could destroy everything you believe in? The question echoed in my mind as I stared at the police station ceiling, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly above me. Detective Michael Reeves, that's me, 15 years on the force and still naively believing I could make a difference in this city. My weathered hands clutched a case file that had landed on my desk this morning, seemingly routine but somehow off. Riverside was once a proud industrial center, now a hollow shell of abandoned factories and desperate people. The precinct sat in what locals called the beating heart, the last neighborhood that hadn't completely surrendered to decay. Rain tapped against the windows, creating shadow patterns that danced across my desk. Something about them made me uneasy. Reeves, you still obsessing over the Donovan case? Captain Hartman's voice startled me. I hadn't heard him approach, which was unusual. My instincts were rarely this dull. Something doesn't add up, I replied, flipping through crime scene photos. Banker jumps from his penthouse the day before he's set to testify in the Meridian corruption trial? Too convenient. Medical examiner ruled it suicide. He even left a note. Hartman's voice carried an edge I couldn't quite place. Let it go. We've got actual murders to solve. As he walked away, I noticed a business card that had fallen from his pocket. Meridian Development Group. The same company Donovan was about to testify against. Could be nothing. Probably nothing. But my neck tingled with that familiar sensation, the one that had kept me alive during my years on the street. I slipped the card into my pocket and returned to the file. James Donovan, 42, Chief Financial Officer at Central Bank, apparent suicide. The photos showed shattered glass, blood spatter consistent with the fall, a typed suicide note. All textbook. Except for one detail that kept nagging at me, the strange symbol drawn in what appeared to be Donovan's blood on his desk calendar. A line bisecting a circle. Not mentioned in any official report. My computer pinged. An email from Dr. Naomi Chen, our newest medical examiner. Subject line, found something unusual. I checked my surroundings before opening it. The office was mostly empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The overhead lights flickered briefly, casting strange shadows in the corners of the room. Detective Reeves, the email read. Before processing the Donovan body, I noticed bruising patterns inconsistent with a fall. Also, toxicology showed trace amounts of an unusual sedative. Could you stop by the morgue? I'd rather discuss this in person. My heart rate quickened. The morgue was in the basement, accessible by a service elevator that always smelled of cleaning chemicals and something else I couldn't identify. As I stepped inside, the lights dimmed momentarily, and I could have sworn I heard breathing that wasn't my own. The doors opened to reveal the sterile corridor leading to the morgue. Usually brightly lit, today several bulbs had burned out, creating pools of darkness between islands of harsh fluorescent light. The distant hum of refrigeration units created an unsettling backdrop to my footsteps. I found myself moving more cautiously than usual. My hand instinctively moved toward my service weapon. The rational part of my brain knew there was nothing to fear in a hospital basement, but something primitive inside me disagreed. Dr. Chen's office door was slightly ajar, light spilling into the darkened hallway. "Naomi?" I called out, pushing the door open wider. The office was empty, her computer still running a screensaver of tropical fish. Coffee steamed in a mug on her desk, seemingly just poured. On her computer screen, minimized but visible, was an image file labeled Donovan_Mark.jpg. I glanced over my shoulder, then moved to her computer. The image showed a close-up of the same symbol I noticed in the crime scene photos, captured in high resolution. Below it, Jeanette typed notes. Symbol matches those found in 3 other apparent suicides over the past 6 months. All victims connected to Meridian Development or Central Bank. Cross-reference with cold cases from 20 years ago shows similar marking. Possible ritualistic element? Sending findings to Detective Reeves and... The note ended there. Unfinished. A crash from the autopsy room startled me. I drew my weapon, moving instinctively toward the sound. The morgue's automatic lights had failed, leaving only the emergency strips glowing dully along the floor. "Dr. Chen?" I called out, my voice sounding thin in the cavernous space. No answer. Only the soft hum of refrigeration units and what might have been footsteps retreating down a distant corridor. I reached for my phone to call for backup, but there was no signal. Of course. We were underground, surrounded by concrete and steel. The exam table in the center of the room held a body covered with a sheet. Donovan, I presumed. But something was wrong. The shape under the sheet seemed different. Smaller. My breath came in short bursts now. My training battled with a growing sense of dread as I approached the table and slowly pulled back the sheet. It wasn't Donovan. It was Dr. Chen. Her eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling. And on her forehead, drawn in what appeared to be her own blood, was the same symbol from Donovan's calendar. A circle bisected by a line. Before I could process what I was seeing, the emergency lights went out, plunging the morgue into complete darkness. In that moment of pure blackness, I felt a presence behind me. Cold breath on my neck. A whispered voice so close I could feel the air move against my ear. "Some lines aren't meant to be crossed, Detective." I spun around, firing blindly into the darkness. The muzzle flash illuminated an empty room in strobe-like bursts. Nothing. No one. When the backup generator finally kicked in, I was alone with Dr. Chen's body and my racing thoughts. And one terrifying realization. I had just stumbled across something much bigger than a suspicious suicide. Something that had tentacles reaching into the police department itself. Something that had gotten to Dr. Chen before she could reveal what she'd found. And now, they knew I was looking. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of official statements, internal affairs interviews, and thinly veiled threats disguised as concerned advice. The official story: Dr. Chen had suffered an aneurysm while examining Donovan's body. A tragic coincidence. The symbol I claimed to have seen? Likely a stress-induced hallucination after discovering a colleague's body. No one mentioned the missing autopsy notes, or the fact that the surveillance cameras in the morgue had malfunctioned during the exact time frame of Chen's death, or that her laptop had been wiped clean in what IT called a routine security protocol. I sat in my apartment that night, blinds drawn, service weapon on the coffee table beside me. Rain lashed against the windows, creating shadowy fingers that seemed to reach into my living room. The power had flickered twice already, each time sending my heart racing. The case files spread across my floor told a disturbing story. James Donovan wasn't the first. Over the past 2 years, 6 high-ranking financial executives had died under questionable circumstances, all ruled suicides, all connected to either Central Bank or Meridian Development Group, all involved in a massive urban renewal project that had displaced thousands of the city's poorest residents. And according to Dr. Chen's preliminary notes, the ones I managed to photograph with my phone before they disappeared, at least 4 had that same strange symbol somewhere at the scene. A circle bisected by a line. My research had turned up references to something called the Dark Line, rumors of a shadow organization that had controlled Riverside's development since the city's founding. Old newspaper clippings mentioned it in relation to unexplained deaths dating back decades, always dismissed as conspiracy theories. My phone rang, startling me. Unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. Detective Reeves. The voice was digitally altered, gender and identity impossible to determine. Parkside Garage. Level 3. 20 minutes. Come alone if you want answers about Chen and Donovan. The line went dead before I could respond. Every instinct told me it was a trap. But what choice did I have? The department was compromised. I had no idea who I could trust. I tucked my backup weapon into my ankle holster, left my official phone on the table, and slipped out through the service entrance of my building. The rain had intensified, turning the streets into mirror-like surfaces that reflected the city lights in distorted patterns. Parkside Garage was an older structure, concrete and steel, perpetually half-empty despite its central location. As I approached on foot, I noticed the security cameras aimed at the entrance were dark. Non-operational. Coincidence? Unlikely. The entrance gate was up, the attendant booth empty. My footsteps echoed unnaturally as I made my way up the concrete ramp to level 3. The few cars present were covered in a thin layer of dust, as if they hadn't moved in weeks. The place had the feeling of a stage set, artificial and waiting. Level 3 was completely deserted and dimly lit, several overhead fixtures either burned out or intentionally darkened. I moved cautiously, staying close to the concrete support pillars, my hand near my weapon. I'm impressed you came, Detective. The voice echoed through the garage, impossible to pinpoint. Not electronically altered now, but female, with a subtle accent I couldn't place. Most people in your position would be booking flights to somewhere far away. Show yourself, I demanded, drawing my weapon but keeping it pointed down. A figure stepped out from behind a support column about 20 meters away. A woman in a tailored suit, her face obscured by shadow. My name is Eleanor Walsh, she said. Until 3 days ago, I was James Donovan's executive assistant. She stepped forward into a pool of light. Mid-40s, sharp features, eyes that held the weary look of someone who had seen too much. And I know why they killed him. Why they killed Dr. Chen. Why they'll kill you if you don't stop digging. Who is they? I asked, still keeping my distance. They call themselves the Directorate. 7 individuals who have controlled this city from the shadows for generations. Banking, development, politics, law enforcement, nothing happens in Riverside without their approval. She took a deep breath. The symbol you found is their mark. They leave it as a warning to others. Why are you telling me this? Why risk your life? Because James wasn't just my boss. We were. She hesitated. Close. And before they killed him, he gave me something. Insurance, he called it. She reached slowly into her jacket, produced a small flash drive. Financial records. Offshore accounts. Evidence of bribes paid to judges, council members, police officials. Names, dates, amounts. Enough to bring down the directorate and half the city's leadership with them. As she held it out to me, a shot rang out, echoing violently through the concrete structure. Eleanor's eyes widened in shock. A red stain bloomed across her white blouse as she collapsed. I dove behind a nearby car as more shots followed, ricocheting off concrete and metal. 3 shooters, I estimated from the different firing positions. Professional. Moving in a coordinated pattern to flank me. Eleanor lay motionless on the ground, the flash drive still clutched in her hand. 20 feet of open space separated us. Impossible to reach without exposing myself. I fired 2 shots toward the nearest muzzle flash, then 2 more in the opposite direction, buying myself seconds. The overhead lights suddenly went out, plunging the garage into near total darkness, save for the distant emergency exit signs casting a sickly green glow. In the darkness, I heard them moving, communicating through hand signals or radio. They knew exactly where I was. But they didn't know I'd come prepared for darkness. I pulled the small flashlight from my jacket, but instead of turning it on, I threw it as far as I could in the opposite direction. When it clattered against the concrete, they fired toward the sound, giving away their positions. I moved low and fast, using the muzzle flashes to orient myself, circling around toward Eleanor. A bullet grazed my arm, but adrenaline dulled the pain to a hot scratch. I reached her body, confirming what I already knew: she was gone. The flash drive was still clutched in her rigid fingers. As I pried it loose, her hand suddenly gripped my wrist with surprising strength. She wasn't dead yet. "Trust no one," she whispered, blood bubbling at her lips. "Especially not." Another shot rang out, striking her in the head before she could finish. This one came from behind me, from a position where none of the shooters had been. A 4th shooter. Someone who had been waiting, watching. I rolled away as more bullets struck where I had just been kneeling. One caught me in the leg, tearing through muscle. The pain was immediate and intense, but I kept moving, half crawling behind a concrete pillar. I was outnumbered, outgunned, and now injured. The rational move would be surrender or retreat. But they hadn't come to arrest me. They'd come to add another suicide to their list. The emergency exit was 30 meters away. I'd never make it on an injured leg with 4 shooters tracking me. I needed a diversion. I removed my belt, wrapped it around my thigh above the wound, and pulled it tight. Then I took out my lighter, a relic from when I used to smoke, and looked around for something flammable. A nearby car had a small oil leak beneath it. It was risky, desperate even. But so was doing nothing. I flicked the lighter, touched it to a scrap of paper from my pocket, and tossed it into the puddle of oil. It caught immediately, the fire spraying along the oil slick toward the car's undercarriage. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I moved as quickly as my injured leg would allow, staying low, using the growing light of the fire and the shouts of confusion from my pursuers as cover. The car's gas tank ignited with a whoosh rather than the Hollywood explosion I'd half expected, but it was enough. Flames engulfed the vehicle, triggering the garage's fire suppression system. Sprinklers activated, alarms blared, and somewhere in the distance, sirens began to wail. In the chaos, I made it to the emergency stairwell. Each step sent waves of agony through my wounded leg, but I kept moving down, away from the shooters, away from Eleanor's body, clutching the flash drive that people were clearly willing to kill for. By the time I reached street level, the garage was swarming with fire trucks and patrol cars. I slipped away into a nearby alley, the rain washing away the blood trail I was leaving. My leg throbbed with every heartbeat, but the belt had slowed the bleeding. I needed somewhere to go, someone to trust. According to Eleanor, that was no one. I thought of Captain Hartman, his dropped business card, his insistence that Donovan's case was closed. I thought of the other detectives in my precinct, any of whom could be on the directorate's payroll. I thought of the fourth shooter, whose position suggested they had been there all along, watching, waiting for Eleanor to hand over the flash drive. There was only one person I could think of who might help me, someone with the technical skills to access whatever was on the drive, someone outside the system, someone with as much reason to hate the power brokers of Riverside as I now had. My estranged brother, Alex. A former cybersecurity expert who'd gone off the grid after being framed for a data breach 3 years ago. A breach that, I now realized, had exposed early plans for the Meridian Development Project. If Alex was still in the city, if he was still alive, if he would even speak to me after I doubted his innocence, those were a lot of ifs. But he was my only hope. As I limped through the rain-slicked alleys, away from the chaos at the garage, I felt eyes on me again. Not the shooters this time. Something else. Somewhere in the shadows above, a security camera silently tracked my movement, its red light blinking like a malevolent eye. In this city, the walls had eyes. The shadows had ears. And I was now enemy number one of people powerful enough to make me disappear without a trace. The only thing keeping me alive was a small flash drive in my pocket, and whatever secrets it contained about the dark line that connected everything in Riverside. Finding Alex wasn't easy. We hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since his trial when I'd sat stoically in my uniform, unable to publicly support him without risking my badge. He'd taken my silence as betrayal, and perhaps it was. After 2 hours of painful searching in the rain, calling in favors from contacts outside the department, I found myself in the industrial district, standing before a converted warehouse with blacked-out windows and multiple layers of security. The bleeding from my leg had slowed, but every movement sent fresh waves of pain radiating through my body. I'd fashioned a crude bandage from my shirt, but I was lightheaded from blood loss and beginning to shiver, early signs of shock. There was no doorbell, just a small camera mounted above a metal door. I looked directly into it and waited. Several minutes passed before the door buzzed and slowly swung open. The space inside was cavernous, the high ceilings lost in darkness. Servers hummed in climate-controlled glass enclosures. Multiple monitors displayed scrolling code and surveillance feeds from around the city. And in the center, bathed in the blue glow of screens, sat my brother. "You look terrible, Mike." Alex hadn't aged well. At 35, he looked 50, gaunt, pale, with long hair tied back and a beard that didn't quite hide the scar along his jaw. A souvenir from prison. "I've been shot," I stated simply, swaying slightly on my feet. "I can see that." He didn't move to help me. "What I can't see is why you'd come here. Last I checked, we weren't exactly on speaking terms. People are dying. I need your help." I pulled out the flash drive. "I need to know what's on this. And I think it might clear your name." Something flickered in his eyes, interest, hope, I couldn't tell. Without a word, he pointed to a chair, then disappeared into another room, returning with a medical kit. "Sit. Take off your pants." As he cleaned and properly bandaged my wound, I told him everything: Donovan, Dr. Chen, Eleanor Walsh, the directorate, the symbol. With each detail, his expression grew darker. "The dark line," he murmured, almost to himself. I found references to it while I was investigating Meridian. Thought it was conspiracy nonsense. It's real, I said. And they're willing to kill to keep it secret. Alex finished bandaging my leg, then took the flash drive, examining it carefully before inserting it into an isolated system, a computer not connected to any network. If there's malware on this, I don't want it infecting my main systems, he explained. The drive was encrypted, but that didn't slow Alex down. His fingers flew across the keyboard, breaking through security layers that would have taken law enforcement tech experts days to crack. Eleanor wasn't exaggerating, he said as files began to appear on screen. This is comprehensive. Financial records going back 20 years. Offshore accounts, shell companies, bribe payments. Names, dates. He looked up at me. Half the city council is on this list. 3 judges. The district attorney. And he turned the monitor toward me. Captain Hartman's name was there, along with bi-weekly payments of $25,000 dating back 6 years. There's more, Alex continued, opening another folder. Project files for something called Nexus. Looks like the next phase of Meridian's development plan. He pulled up architectural renderings and land surveys. They're planning to demolish the entire Riverside Historic District. Thousands more people displaced. That area is protected by preservation laws, I said. They can't just tear it down. According to these documents, the city council is voting next week to remove those protections. It's already decided. The vote is just a formality. Alex opened another file. And here's why. Geological surveys show significant natural gas deposits under the historic district. We're talking billions in potential revenue. The pieces were falling into place. The mysterious deaths, the corruption, the rush to push through the Meridian project despite public opposition. It wasn't just about real estate, it was about what lay beneath the city itself. There's one more folder, Alex said, clicking on an icon labeled simply Legacy. This looks like historical records? The files contain scanned documents dating back to the city's founding in the 1880s. Land grants, corporate charters, birth and death certificates. And a faded photograph of 7 men standing in front of Riverside's first city hall, their faces stern beneath period-appropriate mustaches and hats. The original directorate, I murmured. Alex zoomed in on a symbol carved into the cornerstone of the building behind them. A circle bisected by a line. It's all connected, he said. The same families have controlled this city for generations. Donovan must have discovered this while working on the Meridian financing. And they killed him for it, I finished. Just like they killed Dr. Chen. Like they tried to kill me. These files are enough to bring them down, Alex said. Enough to clear my name too. If we can get them to the right people, I cautioned. The directorate has people everywhere. Not everywhere, Alex smiled for the first time. I still have contacts in federal law enforcement. People outside Riverside's sphere of influence. He began copying the files. But we need to move quickly. The moment he showed up on my security cameras, we're on borrowed time. What do you mean? I monitor CCTV feeds throughout the city. It's how I've stayed ahead of people looking for me. But the system works both ways. If I can access those cameras, so can others. He pointed to monitors showing various street views. I picked up unusual activity about 20 minutes ago. Vehicles circling the area. Men in tactical gear. My blood ran cold. How did they find me? You're wound, Alex said grimly. Modern patrol cars have infrared cameras. They've been following your heat signature, scanning for someone with an injury consistent with the shooting at the garage. As if on cue, one of the monitors showed a black SUV pulling up outside the warehouse. Then another. And another. We need to go. Now. Alex grabbed a laptop and a small bag, then moved to what appeared to be a solid wall. He pressed his hand against it, and a hidden door swung open, revealing a narrow passage. Old smuggling tunnel. Prohibition era. Leads to the river. The sound of the metal door being breached echoed through the warehouse. Heavy footsteps, tactical teams shouting commands. Go, I urged him. Get those files to your federal contacts. I'll hold them off. Alex hesitated. Mike, it's the only way. I'm injured. I'll slow you down. And someone needs to face them. I drew my weapon. Consider it my apology for not believing in you 3 years ago. For a brief moment, I saw the little brother I protected as a child. Then his expression hardened, and he nodded once before disappearing into the tunnel. I positioned myself behind a server bank, using it as cover. The tactical team was moving methodically through the warehouse, checking corners, maintaining formation. Professional. These were regular police officers. They moved like private military contractors. I recognized the leader, Vincent Keller, former Special Forces, now head of security for Meridian Development Group. The pieces connected further. Detective Reeves, Keller called out. There's nowhere to go. You're injured and outnumbered. Surrender now, and you'll be treated fairly. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Like Donovan was treated fairly? Or Dr. Chen? Unfortunate incidents, he replied smoothly. The work we're doing is for the greater good of Riverside. Progress always has casualties. Is that what the directorate tells itself? I asked. That killing innocent people is justifiable for progress? A different voice answered, one I recognized instantly. Captain Hartman stepped into view, flanked by armed men. It's more complicated than you could understand, Mike, he said, sounding almost regretful. This city was dying. The Nexus project will bring jobs, tax revenue, international investment. A few lives weighed against the future of an entire city? That's an easy calculation. Easy for men like you, maybe, I replied. Men who get paid $25,000 every 2 weeks to look the other way. Hartman's expression hardened. The money is irrelevant. I believe in what we're building. You're not building anything, I said. You're destroying. Homes, lives, history, all for gas deposits and profit margins. Enough talk, Keller cut in. Where's the drive, detective? And where's Alexander Reeves? So they knew about Alex too. Had probably known all along. Gone, I said simply. Both of them. The files are already being uploaded to federal servers as we speak. It was a bluff, but the flash of concern that passed between Hartman and Keller told me it had landed. You're lying, Hartman said, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Am I? Check your phones, gentlemen. See if your director and masters are trying to reach you yet. Keller's hand moved instinctively toward his pocket. The momentary distraction was all I needed. I fired twice, hitting the lights above them, plunging the section of the warehouse into darkness. Then I moved, staying low, using the server banks as cover. Gunfire erupted, but it was disorganized, confusion evident in their shouts. I made it to a secondary exit, a loading dock door that Alex had shown me on his security monitors. I slipped outside into the rain, which had intensified into a downpour. Lightning flashed, illuminating the industrial landscape in stark white bursts. My injured leg screamed in protest as I forced myself to run, heading toward the river. I didn't expect to escape, not really. But I could buy Alex more time. Every minute they spent chasing me was another minute for him to get further away with the evidence. I reached the riverbank as another lightning flash revealed a small dock with several boats moored. Behind me, shouts and flashlight beams indicated my pursuers weren't far behind. One of the boats was a small motorized skiff. I climbed aboard, my hands shaking from blood loss and adrenaline as I tried to start the engine. It sputtered, coughed, then roared to life just as the first bullet struck the water around me. I steered into the current, the powerful river immediately sweeping the small craft downstream. The rain made visibility nearly zero, but it also made me a more difficult target. Bullets continued to strike the water, but with decreasing accuracy as the distance grew. Lightning flashed again, and in that moment of illumination, I saw Hartman standing on the dock, his service weapon aimed directly at me. Our eyes met across the distance. For a second, I thought I saw regret in his expression. Then he lowered his weapon. Whether it was mercy or merely the recognition that I was out of effective range, I couldn't say. But as the river carried me away from Riverside toward the neighboring county where the river widened, I allowed myself to hope. Alex would reach his federal contacts. The evidence would come to light. The directorate, with its generations of control and corruption, would finally face justice. But as I checked a wound on my leg, now bleeding freely again, I knew my own future was far from certain. I was an injured fugitive, presumed cop killer, with powerful enemies. If I survived the night, it would be just the beginning of a long road. Another lightning flash revealed something in the water ahead, a larger boat, moored mid-river, its running lights dark. As I drew closer, a familiar figure stood on the deck. Alex. You didn't really think I'd leave you behind again, did you? He called out as he helped me aboard the larger vessel. Family sticks together. The files? I asked through chattering teeth, the blood loss and exposure finally taking their toll. Sent, he confirmed. My contact at the FBI already has a team assembling. By morning, there will be federal agents all over Riverside with warrants for the directorate and everyone on their payroll. He helped me below deck, where it was dry and warm. As he redressed my wound with proper medical supplies, I felt the adrenaline finally leaving my system, exhaustion taking its place. We should keep moving, I murmured, fighting to stay conscious. They'll search the river. Let them search, Alex said confidently. This boat has a modified hull that doesn't show up on sonar. And by dawn, they'll have bigger problems than finding us. I wanted to believe him. Wanted to believe that justice would finally come to Riverside, that the directorate would fall, that the dark line connecting generations of corruption would finally be severed. But as I drifted toward unconsciousness, I remembered Eleanor Walsh's final words, trust no one. And I wondered if, even now, the directorate was already working to contain the damage, to discredit the evidence, to maintain their grip on the city they had controlled for over a century. I wondered if some lines, once drawn, could ever truly be erased. 3 days later, I watched the news from a safe house across the state line. Federal agents had indeed descended on Riverside, arresting council members, judges, police officials. Captain Hartman was shown being led away in handcuffs. The Meridian Development headquarters had been raided, boxes of documents seized. But of the directorate itself, the 7 individuals who supposedly controlled everything from the shadows, there was no mention. No names, no faces. As if they had simply vanished, taking their secrets with them. The symbol, the circle bisected by a line, had been painted on buildings throughout the city overnight. A message? A warning? It was impossible to know. As I turned away from the television, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. A single image, a surveillance photo of Alex and me boarding the riverboat that night, our faces clearly visible. Below it, a simple text, "Some lines aren't meant to be crossed, detective." But some circles never end. And I knew then that it wasn't over. The dark line connecting Riverside's past and present remained unbroken. The circle continued. And somewhere, the directorate was watching, waiting, preparing to reclaim what they considered theirs. But this time, I would be watching too. How many bodies will it take before you believe me? Detective Mikhail Kovarov stared at the crime scene photos spread across his desk, the harsh fluorescent lights of the precinct casting an unnatural pallor over the images. 20 years on the force had hardened him to most horrors, but these particular deaths disturbed him in ways he couldn't articulate. 3 victims in 3 weeks, each found in different locations throughout the city, yet bearing the same peculiar marks, thin, precise lacerations across their wrists and throat that resembled surgical incisions rather than violent cuts. The station hummed with the familiar sounds of ringing phones and muffled conversations, but Mikhail felt strangely isolated, as if encased in a bubble of silence. He ran his fingers through his graying hair, feeling the weight of sleepless nights in the stiffness of his shoulders. A soft knock at his office door broke his concentration. "Any progress?" asked Captain Irina Petrova, her voice low and controlled, though the dark circles under her eyes betrayed her exhaustion. "Nothing concrete," Mikhail replied, gesturing at the photos. The lab found no DNA, no fingerprints. The victims share no obvious connections, different ages, neighborhoods, professions. The only link is the method. Irina leaned against the doorframe, her gaze lingering on the photos. "Have you considered that this might be related to the Colony case?" Mikhail felt a chill crawl up his spine at the mention of that name. The Colony murders had terrorized the city 15 years ago, 7 victims, all bearing similar wounds. The case had gone cold after the prime suspect, Dr. Alexei Kolodny, was found dead in his apartment, an apparent suicide. "Impossible," Mikhail muttered, though doubt crept into his voice. "Kolodny is dead. Maybe someone's continuing his work," Irina suggested. As she spoke, Mikhail noticed something peculiar in one of the photographs, a small, almost imperceptible symbol etched into the victim's skin just below the collarbone. He reached for his magnifying glass, his heart rate quickening as the symbol came into focus, a tiny spiral with what appeared to be a stylized eye at its center. The same mark had been found on Kolodny's victims. Mikhail was about to show Irina when his phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. He answered cautiously. "Detective Kovarov?" The voice on the other end was distorted, as if deliberately altered. "You're looking in the wrong places. Check the old psychiatric hospital on Vesnyanka Street. She's still alive, but not for long." The line went dead before Mikhail could respond. "What is it?" Irina asked, noticing his expression. "I need to go," Mikhail said, grabbing his coat. "Call for backup to meet me at the abandoned psychiatric hospital on Vesnyanka." Outside, the October air bit at his skin as he hurried to his car. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. As he unlocked his vehicle, Mikhail couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He scanned the surroundings but saw nothing unusual, just empty cars and windblown leaves. Yet something felt wrong, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that raised the hairs on his neck. The drive to Vesnyanka Street took 20 minutes through increasingly desolate neighborhoods. The psychiatric hospital had been abandoned for nearly a decade, its funding cut after a series of scandals involving patient mistreatment. As Mikhail parked across the street, he noted with unease that no backup had arrived yet. The building loomed against the darkening sky, its windows like vacant eyes staring down at him. Logic told him to wait for support, but the caller's warning echoed in his mind, "She's still alive, but not for long." Weapon drawn, Mikhail approached the building. The main entrance was chained shut, but a side door hung partially open, its lock broken long ago by urban explorers or the homeless seeking shelter. As he stepped inside, the familiar smells of decay and abandonment greeted him: mold, dust, and something else, something metallic that made his stomach tighten. Blood. His flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing corridors lined with peeling paint and debris. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional drip of water from leaking pipes and the soft crunch of broken glass beneath his feet. "Police," he called out, his voice echoing down the hollow corridors. No response. Mikhail moved deeper into the building, checking rooms methodically. Most were empty save for broken furniture and graffiti. The former patient rooms were small and cell-like, many still containing rusted bed frames bolted to the floor. As he reached the building's east wing, Mikhail noticed fresh scuff marks on the dusty floor, signs of recent movement. Following the trail, he came to a stairwell leading down to the basement level. The air grew colder as he descended, and the metallic smell intensified. The basement corridor stretched before him, doors lining both sides. At the far end, a thin sliver of light escaped from beneath one of them. Mikhail approached cautiously, every sense heightened. He could hear something now, a faint, rhythmic sound. As he drew closer, he recognized it as a metronome, ticking steadily. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The room beyond was surprisingly clean and well lit, a stark contrast to the decay above. Medical equipment lined the walls, monitors, surgical tools, for stands. In the center stood an operating table, and on it lay a woman, unconscious but alive, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. She was strapped down, and fore in her arm, her skin pallid under the harsh lights. The metronome sat on a small table nearby, ticking relentlessly. Mikhail rushed to the woman, checking her pulse. Weak but present. As he began unfastening her restraints, he noticed the fresh incision across her collarbone, the beginning of what would have become the killer's signature wound pattern. He had interrupted the killer mid-process. The realization struck him just as he heard the soft click of the door closing behind him. Mikhail whirled around, raising his weapon, but saw only empty space. Yet he knew with absolute certainty that he was no longer alone. "Show yourself," he demanded, scanning the room's corners. A soft laugh emanated from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Detective Kovarov," a voice whispered, seemingly from the very walls themselves. "How kind of you to join us. I've been expecting you." Mikhail felt a sharp prick at the back of his neck, and the room began to spin. As darkness closed in, his last conscious thought was that the voice sounded impossibly, terrifyingly familiar. It sounded like Dr. Alexei Kolodny. "Is there anyone there? Please, help me." My own voice echoed back to me, weak and unfamiliar. I blinked against the harsh light above, trying to orient myself. My head throbbed with each heartbeat, and when I tried to move, I discovered my wrists and ankles were secured to a cold metal surface. Panic surged through me as fragments of memory returned: the hospital, the woman on the table, the voice, the sting at my neck. I was Detective Mikhail Kovarov, and I was now a prisoner. The room around me was different from where I'd found the woman. Smaller, with bare concrete walls and a single overhead light that buzzed intermittently. Medical equipment surrounded me, monitors displaying my vital signs, first hands, and a tray of gleaming surgical instruments just beyond my reach. The metronome continued its relentless ticking from somewhere nearby, marking time with mechanical precision. How long had I been unconscious? Hours? Days? My mouth felt dry, my thoughts sluggish. I tested my restraints again, thick leather straps reinforced with what felt like metal components, professionally applied. No chance of breaking free. "Hello, Detective." The voice came from behind me, calm and measured. I strained to turn my head, but could only see the edges of a figure moving at the periphery of my vision. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice rougher than I intended. "Where's the woman?" "Ah, Nadia?" She served her purpose. The figure moved into view, and I felt my blood run cold. Dr. Alexei Kolodny looked exactly as he had in the photographs from 15 years ago, tall and slender with sharp features and calculating eyes. But that was impossible. Kolodny was dead. I'd seen the autopsy photos myself. "You're not real," I whispered. The man smiled, adjusting the sleeves of his immaculate white coat. "I assure you, Detective, I'm quite real. More real than you know." He moved to check the monitors displaying my vital signs, his movements precise and unhurried. "Your heart rate is elevated. That's to be expected. Fear is a natural response. You died 15 years ago," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Suicide." "Did I?" He raised an eyebrow, seemingly amused. "Or was that simply what you were meant to believe?" My mind raced, searching for explanations. A copycat? A relative? Or perhaps the man before me was truly Kolodny, having faked his death to escape justice. "Why am I here?" I asked, watching as he prepared a syringe with practiced efficiency. "You're here because you asked too many questions, Detective. Because you saw patterns others missed." He tapped the syringe, expelling air bubbles. "But mostly, you're here because I wanted you here." The room suddenly felt colder. In the distance, I could hear water dripping, each drop amplified in the stillness. The metronome continued its steady beat, somehow more menacing than before. "The others," I said, "the 3 victims from the past weeks." "Necessary steps," he interrupted. "Breadcrumbs, if you will. I needed to get your attention." "You killed 3 people just to lure me here?" He frowned slightly, as if disappointed. "This isn't about you specifically, Detective. It's about completion. About finishing what was started 15 years ago." As he spoke, I became aware of a subtle change in the room's atmosphere. The air felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't identify. The overhead light flickered momentarily, casting strange shadows across Kolodny's face that seemed to distort his features. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my mouth dry. "What?" He considered this, moving the syringe between his fingers with unsettling dexterity. "I want you to understand. To witness. You spent your career trying to make sense of humanity's darkest impulses, categorizing them, containing them. But some things defy categorization, detective. He leaned closer, and I could smell something clinical on his breath, antiseptic, unnaturally clean. Some things exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. The light flickered again, longer this time, and in that momentary darkness, I could have sworn Colony's form changed, elongated, sharpened, became something that wasn't quite human. But then the light stabilized, and he was just a man again, watching me with cold intensity. The symbol, I said, remembering the spiral with the eye at its center. What does it mean? Something flashed in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or approval. You noticed. Most don't, until it's too late. It's a marker, detective. A sign of those who've been touched. Touched by what? Instead of answering, he moved to a small table and lifted the metronome, bringing it closer so I could see it clearly. It wasn't a standard metronome as I'd first thought. The pendulum was unusual, carved from what appeared to be bone, and the markings along its face were not numbers, but tiny, intricate symbols similar to the spiral found on the victims. Time moves differently for those who understand its true nature, Colony said, watching the pendulum swing. What feels like minutes here might be hours elsewhere, or mere seconds. It's all a matter of perception. My training told me to keep him talking, to gather information, to look for weaknesses or opportunities. But another part of me, a primal, instinctive part, wanted nothing more than to get as far away from this man and this room as possible. The backup team knows where I am, I lied. They'll be here soon. Colony smiled thinly. No one is coming, detective. Your Captain Petrova received a message from your phone explaining that you were following a lead out of town. Very convincing, apparently. My stomach dropped. He had access to my phone. Had planned this meticulously. Now, he said, approaching with the syringe, it's time for us to begin. I struggled against my restraints, feeling them cut into my skin. Begin what? Your transformation, he replied simply. Your understanding. As he brought the needle toward my arm, the overhead light flickered violently, then went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. I heard Colony curse softly, followed by the clatter of the syringe falling to the floor. In the darkness, something changed. The air moved differently, carrying sounds I couldn't identify, whispers, perhaps, or the rustling of fabric. And beneath it all, the metronome continued its relentless tick, tick, tick. When the emergency lights finally activated, casting the room in a dull red glow, Colony was staring at the wall behind me, his expression one of fascination and fear. I couldn't turn to see what he was looking at, but I could see its reflection in the polished surface of a medical cabinet, dark shapes moving across the wall, flowing like liquid but maintaining humanoid forms. They seemed to reach toward Colony, undulating in time with the metronome's beat. They're early, he whispered, almost to himself. Too early. The sequence isn't complete. The shapes on the wall grew more defined, their movements more deliberate. One seemed to detach itself from the others, stretching toward Colony until it almost touched him. No, he said firmly, backing away. Not yet. We had an agreement. The temperature in the room plummeted suddenly, my breath forming visible clouds. The restraint on my right wrist loosened unexpectedly, not enough to free me completely, but enough to give me hope. Colony was no longer paying attention to me, his focus entirely on the shapes that now covered most of the wall, their movements becoming increasingly agitated. I've given you what you asked for, he said, his composure cracking. 3 vessels, prepared exactly as specified. The detective is the fourth. You'll have the fifth by midnight. 3 vessels. The previous victims. What did he mean by prepared? And who was he talking to? As I worked at loosening my restraint further, the shapes on the wall seemed to converge, forming a single, massive silhouette that bore the vague outline of a human but was wrong in subtle, disturbing ways, limbs too long, head too angular. Colony reached for something in his coat pocket, a small object that gleamed dully in the red light. An amulet of some kind, inscribed with the same spiral eye symbol. "Remember our pact," he said, holding the amulet toward the shadow. "You cannot cross until the fifth vessel is prepared." The shadow receded slightly, and Colony's posture relaxed. But as he turned back toward me, his expression was strained. "It seems our schedule has been accelerated, Detective," he said, retrieving a new syringe from a drawer. "They're growing impatient." "Who are they?" I asked, still working at my restraint while keeping his attention on my face. "Not who," he corrected. "What?" "They exist in the spaces between life and death, between being and non-being. And they're very, very hungry." As he approached with the syringe, I managed to free my right hand completely. I kept it in place, waiting for the right moment. "You're insane," I said, trying to keep him talking. "Insanity is just another word for perception beyond conventional understanding," he replied, preparing to inject me. "After tonight, you'll see differently too." As he leaned over me, I struck, grabbing his wrist with my freed hand and twisting hard. He cried out in surprise and pain, the syringe falling from his grip. I pulled him off balance, using his momentum to slam his head against the metal table. The impact stunned him long enough for me to work on my other restraints. I freed my left hand and was starting on my ankles when Colony recovered, lunging for me with unexpected strength. We struggled, his hands finding my throat, squeezing with inhuman force. My vision began to darken at the edges. In desperation, I reached blindly for anything I could use as a weapon, my fingers closing around what felt like a scalpel from the nearby tray. I stabbed upward, feeling the blade sink into flesh. Colony gasped, his grip loosening. I pushed him away and freed my ankles, stumbling off the table. Colony staggered back, the scalpel protruding from his shoulder. But instead of pain, his expression showed only mild annoyance. And the blood seeping from the wound wasn't red, it was black, thick as oil. "That," he said calmly, removing the scalpel with a wet sound, "was unnecessary." Behind him, the shadow on the wall stretched forward again, and this time it didn't stop at the edge of the wall. It extended into the room itself, a three-dimensional darkness that seemed to absorb the red emergency light. Colony noticed my expression and turned. The shadow had formed into a vaguely humanoid shape standing between us and the door, its edges constantly shifting, never quite solid. For the first time, genuine fear crossed Colony's face. "No," he said to the figure. "The sequence isn't complete. You cannot cross yet." The shadow tilted what might have been its head, regarding Colony with eyeless attention. Then it extended an arm-like appendage toward him. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted for the second door on the far side of the room, hearing Colony's scream cut short behind me as I fled into the darkness beyond. "What have you brought into this world, Doctor?" The words echoed in my mind as I ran through the darkened corridors of what I now recognized as the hospital's subterranean level, a maze of narrow passages and abandoned rooms that didn't appear on any official blueprints I'd studied. My police training had never prepared me for what I'd just witnessed. I slowed my pace, forcing myself to think rationally despite the panic clawing at my chest. Colony was behind me, possibly dead, possibly transformed, I couldn't be sure. And that thing, that shadow entity, could be anywhere. The emergency lighting was sporadic, casting long stretches of corridor in complete darkness punctuated by islands of dim red illumination. The air was thick with moisture and the smell of rust and mildew. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, each drop amplified in the silence. I needed to find a way out, to warn someone about what was happening here. But first, I needed to understand what exactly I was dealing with. Pressing my back against a wall, I tried to steady my breathing and organize my thoughts. Colony had spoken of vessels and a sequence. The victims were being prepared for something, some kind of ritual or process. And whatever existed on the other side of that wall needed 5 vessels to cross over. I was to be the 4th. And the 5th would be ready by midnight. My watch had been removed, but I estimated I'd been unconscious for at least several hours. It could be approaching midnight already. A faint sound made me freeze, the soft tick-tick-tick of the metronome, barely audible but growing louder. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the very walls were resonating with its rhythm. I moved deeper into the shadows, scanning for any sign of movement. Instead, my eyes caught something else, a faint glow emanating from a partially open door several yards ahead. Cautiously, I approached, the metronome's ticking growing more insistent with each step. Through the gap, I could see what appeared to be an office or study, walls lined with bookshelves, a large desk, and an antique cabinet filled with specimens and jars. After ensuring the room was empty, I slipped inside and closed the door behind me. The source of the glow was a computer monitor still powered on despite the power outage, its screen displaying a series of documents and images. I moved closer, recognizing crime scene photos of the recent victims alongside older images from the original Colony case 15 years ago. But it was the document open beside them that caught my attention, a journal or research log written in Colony's precise handwriting. Day 378 since contact, I read silently. The entities continue to communicate through the liminal spaces. They require physical anchors to maintain presence in our reality, vessels prepared according to their specific requirements. The incisions must follow the precise pattern to create the necessary connections between their realm and ours. My skin crawled as I scrolled through pages of meticulous notes detailing Colony's experiments, the preparation of human subjects through specific surgical procedures, the application of the spiral eye symbol to mark them as conduits, the use of the metronome to synchronize the vibrational frequencies between dimensions. According to his notes, Colony believed he had discovered entities existing in a parallel reality that intersected with our own in certain locations, thin spots where the barriers between worlds had worn away. The abandoned hospital was apparently built on such a spot. 15 years ago, Colony had attempted to create a permanent gateway for these entities to cross over using 7 human vessels. He had been stopped after the 7th victim, apparently by investigators closing in. He had faked his suicide and gone into hiding, continuing his research in secret. Now he was trying again, with a refined approach requiring only 5 vessels instead of 7. I was about to search for more information when the metronome's ticking suddenly intensified, becoming almost painful in its precision. The computer screen flickered, displaying a new window, security camera footage of a room similar to the one where I'd been held. On the table lay a woman, strapped down and unconscious. Standing over her was a figure that resembled Colony, but something was wrong with the image. The figure moved jerkily, its proportions subtly distorted, as if someone was wearing Colony's skin without quite understanding how to make it move naturally. With horrifying precision, the figure began making incisions on the woman's body, following the pattern I'd seen on the previous victims. This was happening now, the preparation of the fifth vessel. I needed to find that room and stop whatever was happening. But as I turned to leave, my eyes fell on one final note at the bottom of Colony's journal. The entities cannot be stopped once the gateway is opened. They exist outside our understanding of physics and biology. Their hunger is limitless. God forgive me for what I've unleashed. The metronome's ticking suddenly ceased, leaving an unnatural silence in its wake. And in that silence, I heard breathing, wet, labored breathing, just outside the office door. I looked around desperately for a weapon, grabbing a heavy brass paperweight from the desk just as the door began to open slowly. What entered wasn't Colony, at least not entirely. The thing wearing his form had his general appearance, but its movements were wrong, too fluid in some ways, too rigid in others. Its head tilted at an impossible angle, and its eyes were completely black, like pools of oil. Detective, it said in a voice that approximated Colony's but contained other voices beneath it, layered and discordant. You shouldn't be here. The sequence requires your preparation. I backed away, gripping the paperweight. What are you? The thing smiled, its face stretching unnaturally wide. We are the spaces between. We are what waits beyond the threshold of perception. And we are so very hungry. It moved toward me with unnatural speed, covering half the distance between us in a single step. I hurled the paperweight at its head, connecting with a wet thud that would have incapacitated a normal human. The thing merely paused, its head indenting where the heavy object struck before slowly reforming. I grabbed the computer monitor and threw it as well, using the distraction to dart past the creature toward the door. Its arm shot out, elongating impossibly to grab my jacket. I slipped out of it and kept running, hearing a sound behind me that might have been laughter or screaming or both. The corridors seemed different now, warping and shifting in my peripheral vision. I ran without clear direction, turning corners at random, desperately searching for stairs leading up. The emergency lights flickered more violently, some exploding as I passed beneath them, showering me with glass. The air grew colder with each step, my breath clouding before me. I turned another corner and skidded to a halt. Before me stood a large double door marked Surgical Theater 3. From beyond it came the steady ticking of the metronome. The fifth vessel. The woman I'd seen on the security footage was inside, being prepared for whatever twisted ritual Colony, or the thing now wearing his form, had planned. I had no weapon, no backup, and no real understanding of what I was facing. But I couldn't leave that woman to become part of this nightmare. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the doors open. The surgical theater was larger than I expected, a circular room with tiered seating surrounding a central operating area. Overhead lights focused on the table at the center, where the woman lay motionless. Standing over her was not the distorted version of Colony I'd encountered, but someone else, a slender figure in surgical scrubs, face obscured by a mask. The metronome sat on a small table nearby, its bone pendulum swinging with hypnotic regularity. The surgeon looked up as I entered, and I recognized her immediately, Captain Irina Petrova. "Mikhail," she said calmly, lowering her scalpel. "You're early." My mind reeled. Irina? What the hell is going on? What are you doing? She sighed, removing her surgical mask to reveal an expression of mild disappointment. "I was hoping you wouldn't find your way here until we finished. It would have been easier for you." "Easier?" I stepped forward cautiously, trying to keep my voice level. "You're working with Colony? With whatever he's become?" "Working with?" She laughed softly. No, Mikhail. I've been directing this from the beginning. She gestured to the unconscious woman. Dr. Kalanin was brilliant but ultimately limited by his humanity. He discovered the entities, yes, but he never truly understood what they offered. The room felt wrong, the angles and proportions shifting subtly while I wasn't looking directly at them. The walls seemed to pulse in time with the metronome, expanding and contracting like a living thing breathing. Where are they? I asked, moving slowly around the edge of the room, looking for an opportunity to reach the woman on the table. Irina watched me with strange detachment. They are ancient. Older than humanity, older than this world. They exist in the spaces between dimensions, watching, waiting, hungry. And you're helping them, what? Invade our world? Transform it, she corrected. Humanity has reached its limit, Mikhail. We destroy everything we touch. The entities offer something better, a new kind of existence, beyond physical limitation, beyond death itself. As she spoke, I noticed dark veins spreading beneath her skin, pulsing with something that wasn't blood. They've already changed you, I said. She smiled, the expression not quite reaching her eyes. They've improved me. Enhanced what was already there. By turning you into a murderer. A creator, she countered. The vessels aren't destroyed, Mikhail. They transcend. Their consciousness becomes part of the collective, their physical forms gateways for the entities to experience our world. The metronome's ticking grew louder, and the lights overhead began to flicker rhythmically in time with its beat. Shadows on the walls deepened and moved, forming patterns that hurt my eyes if I looked at them too long. And you need 5 vessels, I said, continuing to circle. 3 already dead, me as the 4th, and her as the 5th. Irina nodded. The sequence requires 5 points to create the pentagram. Once complete, the barrier between worlds dissolves permanently. And then what happens? Then, she said, eyes gleaming with fervent belief, we ascend. All of us. The entities will remake humanity in their image, free from disease, from aging, from the limitations of individual consciousness. You're talking about the end of humanity as we know it. I'm talking about evolution, Mikhail. The next step. As we spoke, I managed to position myself on the opposite side of the operating table from Irina. The woman strapped to it was young, perhaps in her 20s, with incisions already started along her collarbone in a familiar pattern. And if I try to stop you? I asked. Irina's expression softened with what appeared to be genuine regret. You can't. The process has already begun. The first 3 vessels have opened the initial pathways. Even now, the entities are crossing over through them. As if on cue, the temperature in the room plummeted. The shadows on the walls coalesced, forming 3 distinct silhouettes that began to detach themselves from the flat surface, gaining dimension and substance. You see? Irina said, her voice taking on a reverent quality. They come. The shadow figures were more defined now than what I'd seen earlier, vaguely humanoid but wrong in fundamental ways, with too many angles and proportions that seemed to shift constantly. They moved with fluid grace toward us, leaving trails of darkness in the air behind them. The metronome's ticking reached a fever pitch, the bone pendulum swinging so rapidly it became a blur. I had seconds to act. Without further hesitation, I lunged forward and grabbed the metronome, hurling it against the far wall with all my strength. It shattered, pieces of bone and metal scattering across the floor. The effect was immediate and violent. The room itself seemed to convulse, the walls bulging inward then snapping back. The shadow entities writhed, their forms destabilizing. Irina screamed, a sound of rage and pain that didn't sound entirely human. "What have you done?" I didn't answer, focusing instead on freeing the woman from the table. As I worked at her restraints, the shadows recovered, moving toward us with renewed purpose. "They're still coming," Irina said, regaining her composure. "You've merely disrupted the synchronization. The gateway remains partially open." One of the shadow entities reached her, enveloping her in darkness. Instead of fear, her face showed ecstasy as the darkness seeped into her skin, her veins turning black, her eyes filling with inky shadows. "It feels incredible," she gasped, her voice overlapping with other voices. "Join us, Mikhail. Experience what lies beyond the threshold." I freed the woman and lifted her from the table, backing toward the exit. The other two shadow entities blocked my path, their forms shifting constantly, reaching toward me with appendages that weren't quite arms. Irina advanced, her movements becoming as fluid and wrong as the thing that had been wearing Colony's form. The fifth vessel must be prepared. The sequence must be completed. I searched desperately for a way out, my back now against the wall. The unconscious woman in my arms was dead weight, making any quick movement impossible. Then I noticed something, a fire alarm on the wall beside me, ancient but possibly still functional. I shifted the woman's weight and pulled the alarm with my free hand. Nothing happened for a moment. Then, with a groaning mechanical sound, sprinklers in the ceiling activated, spraying the room with water. Simultaneously, a piercing alarm began to wail throughout the building. The shadow entities recoiled from the water, their forms sizzling and steaming where the droplets touched them. Irina screamed again, this time in genuine pain, her skin blistering where the water made contact. "It burns," she shrieked, her voice no longer entirely her own. I used the distraction to run for the exit, carrying the woman through the double doors and back into the corridor. Behind me, the inhuman screams continued, punctuated by the relentless wail of the fire alarm. The sprinklers had activated throughout the basement level, creating a gauntlet of water I had to navigate while carrying my unconscious burden. The shadow entities wouldn't follow, not through the water, but Irina might, or whatever remained of her. I found stairs leading upward and took them two at a time, my muscles burning with the effort of carrying the woman. Above us, I could see light, real light, not the red emergency glow, suggesting we were approaching the main floor. As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard movement behind me. Looking back, I saw Irina ascending, her movements jerky and uncoordinated, her skin bubbling and reforming where the water had touched it. "Mikhail," she called, her voice a discordant blend of her own and something inhuman. "You cannot stop what has been set in motion. The gateway is open. They are coming through." I pushed through the door at the top of the stairs, emerging into the main corridor of the hospital's ground floor. Daylight streamed through broken windows. It was morning. I'd been in that nightmare basement all night. Outside, I could hear sirens approaching. The fire alarm had triggered an automatic response from emergency services. Help was coming, but I couldn't wait. I adjusted my grip on the woman and moved toward the main entrance, every muscle screaming in protest. Behind me, I heard the stairwell door burst open as Irina emerged into the corridor. "They are coming, Mikhail," she called after me, her voice echoing unnaturally. "You've only delayed the inevitable." I didn't look back, focusing instead on reaching the exit. The morning sun streamed through the shattered glass doors ahead, promising safety. But as I approached, the light began to dim, as if something was blocking it from the outside. Dark shadows gathered around the entrance, undulating and coalescing into forms similar to what I'd seen in the basement. More of the entities approaching from outside. We were surrounded. I backed away, looking frantically for another exit. A service corridor to my right seemed clear. Perhaps it led to a rear entrance. "You see?" Irina said, her footsteps growing closer. "They're everywhere now. The transformation has begun." I ducked into the service corridor, moving as quickly as I could with my burden. The woman in my arms stirred slightly, moaning. She was beginning to regain consciousness. The corridor ended at a heavy metal door marked emergency exit. I pushed through it, emerging into a loading area at the rear of the hospital. The morning air was crisp and cold, a shocking contrast to the stale atmosphere inside. Emergency vehicles were pulling up at the front of the building, their lights flashing through the early morning mist. But between us and them stood more of the shadow entities, their forms more substantial in the daylight than they had been in the darkness below, like figures carved from liquid obsidian, constantly shifting and reforming. I set the woman down gently against a wall, checking her vital signs. Her pulse was steady, and the incisions on her collarbone were shallow. Irina hadn't had time to complete whatever ritual she had planned. "Wake up," I urged, patting her face slightly. "We need to move." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then widening with terror as memories returned. "The doctor," she gasped. "The shadows." "I know," I said, helping her to her feet. "What's your name?" "Elena," she replied, leaning heavily against me. "Elena Kozlova." "I'm Detective Mikhail Kovarov. We need to get to those emergency vehicles, but we have to be careful. Those things are still out there." Elena nodded, her face pale but determined. "I saw them. While he was operating, they were watching from the walls." We moved cautiously along the edge of the building, staying close to the wall. The shadow entities hadn't noticed us yet, their attention focused on the emergency responders at the front. From my position, I could see firefighters preparing to enter the building, unaware of the nightmare waiting inside. I needed to warn them. "Wait here," I told Elena, helping her sit behind a dumpster that would keep her hidden. "I'm going to try to reach those firefighters." "Don't leave me," she pleaded, grabbing my arm. "I'll be right back," I promised. "Those men are walking into a death trap. I have to warn them." She released me reluctantly, and I moved toward the front of the building, keeping low and using abandoned vehicles in the parking lot as cover. I was halfway there when I heard Irina's voice behind me. "Running won't save you, Mikhail," she called, her voice carrying unnaturally across the distance. "Or her. The gateway remains open. They will find both of you." I turned to see her standing at the emergency exit, her appearance now more entity than human, her skin rippling with darkness beneath, her movements fluid and raw. The shadow entities near the emergency vehicles turned at the sound of her voice, their attention shifting toward me. One of them moved with frightening speed, covering the distance between us in seconds. I ran, abandoning stealth for speed, waving my arms at the emergency responders. "Get back," I shouted. "Evacuate the area." The firefighters turned, confused by my appearance and warnings. One of them stepped forward, reaching for his radio, but froze as he caught sight of something behind me. The shadow entity had stopped, keeping just out of the direct sunlight. It hovered at the edge of the parking lot, a writhing mass of darkness that seemed to bend the light around it. "What the hell is that?" the firefighter asked, his face pale. "Something not of this world," I replied, gasping for breath. There are more inside. You need to call for backup, military backup. This isn't a normal fire. Before he could respond, a scream cut through the morning air, Elena's scream, coming from the rear of the building. I spun around, my heart racing. Stay back, I warned the firefighters. And call every available unit. Without waiting for a response, I ran back toward where I'd left Elena, circling around the shadow entity that still lurked at the edge of the parking lot. When I reached the dumpster where I'd hidden her, Elena was gone. But a trail of dark liquid led from the spot toward a service road behind the hospital. Not blood, the same black, oily substance I'd seen seeping from Colony when I stabbed him. I followed the trail, my police training warring with the primal fear that urged me to run in the opposite direction. It led to a small maintenance shed some 50 yards from the main building. The door stood ajar, and from within came the sound of the metronome, impossible, since I destroyed it in the operating theater. Yet its distinctive tick-tick-tick was unmistakable. I approached cautiously, aware that I was walking into a trap, but seeing no alternative. Elena was inside, and I couldn't abandon her. Pushing the door open fully, I stepped into the dimly lit interior. The shed was larger than it appeared from outside, filled with maintenance equipment and old hospital furniture. In the center stood Irina, or what remained of her. The transformation had progressed further, her skin now almost completely black, her limbs elongated, her features fluid and shifting. Beside her stood another figure I recognized as the thing wearing Colony's form. Between them knelt Elena, held immobile by two of the shadow entities. Her eyes found mine, wide with terror. "Mikhail," Irina said, her voice a chorus of discordant sounds. "You've arrived just in time for the completion." "Let her go," I demanded. "Whatever you're planning, it won't work. The authorities know about this place now." "Authorities," the Colony thing said dismissively. "What can they do against forces that exist beyond physical laws? They cannot stop what has already begun." On a small table beside them sat another metronome, identical to the one I destroyed, its bone pendulum swinging with hypnotic precision. "The sequence must be completed," Irina continued. 5 vessels to open the gateway fully. With 4, the entities can cross in limited numbers, but with 5, the barrier dissolves permanently. As she spoke, I noticed something I hadn't before, a pattern on the floor beneath them, drawn in the same black substance that had trailed from Elena's hiding place. A pentagram, with Elena positioned at one point. The other points were marked with small objects, personal items, I realized, taken from the previous victims. "I destroyed the metronome," I said, stalling for time, hoping the firefighters had called for backup as I'd requested. "One of many," Colony replied. "The instruments are merely physical manifestations of the rhythm that exists between worlds. Destroy one, and another takes its place." Irina stepped forward, her movements unnaturally graceful. "Join us willingly, Mikhail. Experience the transformation. It is beyond description." "I've seen what it did to you," I said. "You're not even human anymore." "We are more than human," she replied. "Beyond the limitations of flesh and individual consciousness." The shadow entities holding Elena began to change, their forms merging with her skin, causing her to convulse and scream. Black veins spread across her visible skin, pulsing with whatever substance flowed through the entities. "Stop!" I shouted, stepping forward. "It's already done," Colony said. "The 4th vessel is being prepared. You will be the 5th. The metronome's ticking intensified, and the pentagram on the floor began to glow with an unnatural light, pulsing in rhythm with the pendulum. In desperation, I looked around for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes fell on a can of gasoline stored with the maintenance equipment. The entities were creatures of shadow, I reasoned. They had recoiled from the water in the sprinkler system. Perhaps they would react even more strongly to fire. I lunged for the gasoline can, unscrewing the cap as I moved. The shadow entities flowed toward me, but not quickly enough. I splashed the gasoline in a wide arc, covering the metronome, the pentagram, and as much of the shed as I could reach. Colony realized what I was doing too late. "No," he screamed, his voice inhuman. "The sequence must be completed." I pulled a lighter from the pocket of a nearby work jacket and flicked it to life. "Burn in whatever hell you came from," I said, and dropped the flame onto the gasoline-soaked floor. The fire spread instantly, racing across the floor toward the pentagram. I used the moment of confusion to dash toward Elena, grabbing her arm and pulling her away from the shadow entities, which recoiled from the rapidly spreading flames. Irina and Colony screamed in unison, their forms writhing as the fire reached them. The shadow entities thrashed wildly, their substance seeming to boil and evaporate where the flames touched them. The metronome caught fire, its bone pendulum blackening and curling in the heat. As it burned, a high-pitched wailing filled the air, a sound not quite of this world, the death cry of things that perhaps had never truly been alive. I dragged Elena toward the door, fighting through the rapidly spreading smoke. Behind us, the shed was becoming an inferno, the maintenance chemicals catching fire and intensifying the blaze. We burst outside into the morning air, gasping and coughing. I pulled Elena as far from the shed as our strength would allow, finally collapsing onto the grass several hundred feet away. The shed exploded behind us, the force of the blast knocking us flat. Debris rained down around us as black smoke billowed into the clear morning sky. Emergency vehicles were speeding toward us, sirens wailing. In the distance, I could hear the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors, military backup, responding to the firefighters' call. Elena gripped my hand, her skin still marred by the black veins where the entities had touched her. "Are they gone?" she asked, her voice hoarse from smoke and screaming. I looked back at the burning shed, watching as tendrils of darkness rose from the flames, not smoke, but the remnants of the shadow entities dissipating into the morning air. "I think so," I said, not entirely convinced. "At least for now." As the emergency responders reached us, I stared at the black veins still visible on Elena's skin and wondered if we had truly stopped what had been set in motion or merely delayed it. The metronome's rhythm seemed to echo in my mind, a phantom ticking that I feared might never truly fade. Is this really the only way? Elena's question hung in the frigid air of the mountain cave, her voice barely audible over the howling wind outside. We stood before an ancient stone altar, its surface carved with symbols similar to the protective amulets we wore, but older, more primal in their execution. Dr. Anastasia Kuznetsova nodded grimly, her weathered face illuminated by the flickering torches that lined the cave walls. "The connection must be severed completely. The entities have marked you both deeply. The longer you carry their taint, the stronger their influence becomes. Our journey to the Vigil Sanctuary had been a nightmare of narrow escapes and growing paranoia. Twice we'd been forced to abandon my car when shadow entities tracked us through roadside surveillance cameras. We traveled the final 50 kilometers on foot through dense forest and treacherous mountain terrain, guided only by the coordinates Dr. Volkov had provided. The sanctuary itself was not what I'd expected, not a modern facility with advanced equipment, but an ancient cave system deep within the mountains, modified over centuries by those who understood the threat the entities posed. "The procedure is dangerous," Dr. Kuznetsova continued, preparing various implements on a small table beside the altar. We will be working at the threshold between worlds. The entities will sense what we're attempting and try to stop us. I touched the black veins that had spread further across my skin during our journey, now reaching from my wrist nearly to my elbow. Elena's condition had deteriorated more rapidly, the darkness mapping her veins now visible across her neck and face. And always, constantly, the metronome's rhythm ticked in our minds, growing louder with each passing day. Sometimes now I could hear voices beneath the ticking, whispering, promising, threatening. What exactly will happen? I asked, watching as Kuznetsova mixed powders and liquids in small stone bowls. I will open a controlled gateway, she explained. Not wide enough for the entities to cross over, but enough to access the energy of their realm. That energy can be redirected, used to burn away the connection they've established with you. And the risk? Elena pressed. Kuznetsova met her gaze directly. If the gateway becomes unstable, the entities could use it to cross over. Or your consciousness could be pulled through into their realm. Either way, the consequences would be unfortunate. A masterpiece of understatement. I had glimpsed the entity's realm in my increasingly vivid dreams, a place of perpetual twilight, where shadows had substance and the laws of physics were more suggestion than rule. To be trapped there would be a fate worse than death. There's no other way? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The mark they've left on you is both physical and metaphysical, Kuznetsova said. Conventional medicine cannot touch it. This method has worked before, not always, but often enough to justify the risk. Elena and I exchanged glances. We had come too far to turn back now. I'll go first, I said, removing my shirt to reveal the full extent of the black veins spreading across my torso. Kuznetsova nodded and gestured to the altar. Lie down. Try to relax. Fighting the process will only make it more difficult. As I positioned myself on the cold stone, I noticed intricate channels carved into its surface, spiraling outward from the center where my body lay. The symbols etched around the edges seemed to flicker and shift in the torchlight, as if alive. When I lay down on the cold stone of the altar, Dr. Kuznetsova began to monotonously utter words I couldn't understand, likely an ancient language known only to those who had opposed the entities from the other side for centuries. The symbols around the altar began to glow with a faint bluish light. The air around us thickened, becoming difficult to breathe. I felt the metronomic ticking in my head grow louder, more furious, as if the entities sensed our attempt to break free and were trying to prevent it. Don't move, Kuznetsova ordered sternly, placing small stone bowls with mixtures at specific points along the carved channels in the altar. She dipped her fingers in one bowl containing a silvery substance and traced symbols onto my chest, directly over my heart. The liquid burned like ice against my skin, sending waves of numbing cold through my body. I gasped, fighting the instinct to arch my back away from the pain. The gateway is forming, Kuznetsova murmured, her eyes fixed on a point above my chest. I can feel their resistance. Elena gripped my hand, her fingers trembling. Stay with us, she whispered. The ticking in my mind crescendoed to an unbearable volume, drowning out all other sound. Beneath it, the voices became clearer, screaming, hissing, promising retribution if I continued. The black veins across my skin began to pulse, throbbing with a life of their own. Suddenly, the air above me split open, not visibly, but I could feel it, a tear in the fabric of reality. Wind that wasn't wind rushed through the cave, extinguishing several torches. What remained cast wild, dancing shadows on the walls. They're fighting hard, Kuznetsova shouted over the noise that only we could hear. Her hands moved with practiced precision, manipulating energies I couldn't see but could definitely feel. Your connection to them is stronger than I anticipated. The pain intensified, radiating from my chest outward. The black veins began to burn as if acid flowed through them instead of blood. I bit down on my lip to keep from screaming, tasting copper as my teeth broke skin. "It's working," Elena gasped, pointing at my arm. Through watering eyes, I saw the darkness in my veins receding slightly, pulling back toward my chest. "The entities will try to pull you through," Kuznetsova warned, her voice strained with effort. "They'll show you visions, offer you what you desire most. Resist them." As if summoned by her words, the cave around me began to dissolve. I was standing in a sunlit laboratory, modern equipment humming pleasantly. Papers covered in complex equations lined the walls, solutions to the theoretical problems I'd been working on for years. A man I recognized as Professor Volkov, but younger, healthier than when I'd last seen him, smiled at me from across the room. "Impressive work," he said warmly. "Your breakthrough changes everything. We understand that now communication is possible. Cooperation, even. No need to sever the connection." I felt a tugging sensation, urging me to step fully into this reality. It would be so easy. "Lies." Kuznetsova's voice cut through the vision, distant but determined. "Focus on my voice. What they offer isn't real." The laboratory flickered like a failing projection. Behind it, I glimpsed something else writhing darkness, shapes that hurt the mind to perceive. With tremendous effort, I rejected the vision, focusing instead on the physical pain of my body on the altar, on Elena's hand gripping mine. The laboratory shattered completely, replaced by the cave once more. The tear above me was closing, but as it did, the black veins across my skin began to migrate, flowing like liquid toward my chest, drawn to the diminishing gateway. The pain was excruciating, but I could see the darkness being pulled from me, flowing upward through the closing tear. I screamed then, unable to contain it any longer, as the last of the infection was ripped from my body. Then, silence. The ticking stopped so abruptly that the absence of it left me disoriented. The cave was quiet except for our heavy breathing and the renewed crackling of the torches. "It's done," Kuznetsova said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. She helped me sit up, examining my skin where the black veins had been. Only faint silver scars remained, tracing patterns like lightning strikes across my arms and chest. Elena stared at me in wonder, then looked down at her own marked skin. "And me? Can you?" A low rumble interrupted her, the cave floor trembling beneath us. Dust and small stones rained from the ceiling. "They're angry," Kuznetsova said grimly, already preparing the altar again. "We must complete your procedure quickly. They'll try harder to prevent it now that they've lost one connection." As Elena took my place on the altar, her eyes wide with fear and determination, I realized that severing our connection was only the beginning. The entities had marked others, were spreading their influence through technology and networks worldwide. Our escape from them was temporary at best. The real fight, to expose their existence and develop defenses that didn't require ancient rituals in hidden caves, was just beginning. But for now, as I watched Kuznetsova prepare to free Elena, I allowed myself to feel one thing I hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. Do you ever feel that some sounds never truly die? The old hospital corridor stretched before me like the throat of some dormant beast. My footsteps echoed against the peeling walls, each step returning to me a fraction of a second later, as if someone were following just behind. I'd come here on assignment, a typical photojournalist gig documenting abandoned places for a feature in Urban Exploration Monthly. Nothing I hadn't done dozens of times before. The Blackwell Psychiatric Institute had been closed for 23 years, but something about it felt uncomfortably alive. I adjusted my camera strap and checked my watch, 4:30 in the afternoon. Plenty of daylight left. My editor, Maxwell, had warned me not to stay after sunset, not because he believed in ghosts, but because the structural integrity of the century-old building was questionable at best. Just get some decent shots of the therapy rooms and that weird acoustic chamber they had, he'd said. The readers eat that stuff up. The air inside was stagnant, heavy with dust and the faint smell of old paper and chemicals. I'd expected graffiti, signs of squatters, the usual evidence of human intrusion that follows abandonment, but Blackwell was strangely pristine in its decay. Almost as if it had been waiting, undisturbed. I pushed through a set of double doors and found myself in what must have been a common area. Sunlight filtered through grimy windows, casting long, angular shadows across worn linoleum floors. As I raised my camera to frame a shot of an overturned chair, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping from somewhere down the hallway. Tap. 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 I lowered my camera. Hello? My voice sounded flat against the walls. No response, but the tapping continued. Probably water dripping from a broken pipe, I reasoned. Old buildings make noises, it's what they do. I moved deeper into the building, photographing the remnants of human lives once contained here, a chest set with pieces still arranged mid-game, patient records scattered across the floor of the nurse's station, a single slipper lying in the middle of a hallway as if its owner had simply vanished. The tapping followed me. Sometimes it seemed to come from above, sometimes from behind closed doors I passed. But whenever I stopped to listen more carefully, it would cease, only to resume when I began moving again. Just the building settling, I muttered to myself, but the words felt hollow as soon as they left my lips. I found the acoustic chamber on the 3rd floor. It was a large, cylindrical room with curved walls designed to amplify and direct sound, used for some experimental therapy in the 1970s, according to my research. The door was heavy metal, and it groaned as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was different, denser somehow, as if the molecules themselves were packed more tightly together. I stepped into the center of the room and exhaled slowly, watching my breath form a small cloud in the suddenly cold air. Hello, I said experimentally, and the word bounced back to me, distorted. Hello, hello, hello. The echo lingered longer than it should have, transforming into something that sounded almost like a word I couldn't quite catch. I cleared my throat and tried again. Testing. Testing, listening. I froze. I hadn't said listening. I was certain of it. A chill ran up my spine as the echo continued, no longer mirroring my voice, but forming its own phrases, too garbled to understand but unmistakably words. The tapping started again, louder now, coming from inside the walls of the chamber. It was no longer rhythmic but erratic, like knuckles rapping in increasing frustration. The temperature plummeted further, and I could see my breath streaming out before me in long, panicked clouds. Who's there? I called, and immediately regretted it as the echo transformed my question. Who's there, Yuri? We're here. My rational mind grasped for explanations, unusual acoustics, the wind finding its way through cracks in the walls, my own imagination working overtime in this admittedly creepy setting. But deeper instincts were already triggering my flight response. I backed toward the door, my camera forgotten in my shaking hands. The tapping intensified, now sounding like dozens of fingers drumming against the walls from all directions. As I reached for the door handle, the sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was so complete, so absolute, that it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Then, directly behind me, so close I could feel the breath on my neck, a voice whispered, "They never let us leave." I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs. The room was empty, but the echo remained, transforming, multiplying. "Never leave, never leave, never leave." I stumbled out of the chamber, slamming the heavy door behind me. The corridor outside seemed unnaturally dark now, but my watch showed it was only 5:15. The sun shouldn't be setting yet. I leaned against the wall, trying to steady my breathing, to rationalize what I'd heard. Just an acoustic anomaly. Just my mind playing tricks. But as I pushed myself upright and turned to head back toward the stairs, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The corridor I'd come through was different now. Where there had been an open hallway, there were now dozens of doors stretching into darkness. And from behind each one, I could hear faint tapping. I stood frozen before the impossible corridor. My mind raced to find a rational explanation. I'd taken a wrong turn, become disoriented in the similar-looking hallways. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the case. The building itself seemed to be shifting around me, rearranging its anatomy like a living organism. "Get it together," I whispered, my voice thin and reedy in the thickening air. I pulled out my phone to check the floor plan I downloaded. No signal, of course, but the offline map should still work. The screen remained black. Dead battery? Impossible. It had been at 80% just minutes ago. The tapping continued behind the doors, now falling into an unsettling synchronization. Tap, tap. Tap, tap. Like a heartbeat. Or footsteps approaching. I needed to find the stairs. Get out. Call Maxwell and tell him to find another photographer willing to document this godforsaken place. I turned left, walking briskly, fighting the urge to run. Running felt dangerous somehow, like it might trigger something to chase me. The corridor seemed to elongate with each step, stretching impossibly before me. The doors I passed were identical, save for small number plates: 301, 302, 303. How many rooms could there possibly be on one floor? My breathing grew shallow as I passed room 317. The tapping followed me, always just behind the door I'd most recently passed. I glanced over my shoulder and nearly screamed. The corridor behind me had changed again. Where I'd seen dozens of doors moments before, now there was only a solid wall. I was being herded. A door to my right creaked open, room 321. Against every survival instinct, I found myself drawn toward it. The room beyond was dark, but I could make out the silhouette of old recording equipment. Large reel-to-reel tape machines lined one wall, their metallic surfaces dully reflecting what little light filtered in from the hallway. "Hello?" I called, instantly regretting the sound of my voice breaking the silence. The door swung shut behind me with a decisive click. I lunged for the handle, but it refused to turn. Trapped. My eyes adjusted slowly to the darkness. This must have been where they recorded the sessions in the acoustic chamber. Ancient microphones hung from the ceiling like strange fruit. A control panel with dozens of knobs and switches covered the far wall. And in the center of the room, an old wooden chair faced a large glass window that looked into another room, presumably an observation area. A red light blinked on one of the tape machines. Active. Recording. I approached it cautiously, drawn by the rhythmic flashing, the only source of light in the room now that the door had closed. The reels were turning, though the machine wasn't plugged into any visible power source. The tape moved silently, which seemed wrong somehow. These old machines should work and click. I reached out, hesitant, and pressed the playback button. Static filled the room, so loud it covered my ears in pain. Then it settled into a pattern, a rhythm that matched the tapping I'd been hearing. And beneath it, voices, fragmented, distorted, multiple conversations overlapping. I strained to make out words. Subject displays marked improvement after acoustic therapy. Please, I don't want to go back in there. Unusual phenomena recorded during session 37. They won't stop screaming, "Doctor," even when no one is making a sound. I backed away from the machine, but the volume only increased. The voices grew more frantic, more numerous, until they blended into a cacophony of pleas and clinical observations. The red recording light pulsed faster, like an agitated heartbeat. Then, cutting through the chaos, a single voice, clear, close, as if speaking directly into my ear. They're using the echoes to cross over. They found the frequency. The temperature in the room plummeted again. My breath clouded before me, and the glass of the observation window began to frost over from the inside, intricate patterns spreading across its surface like growing veins. Something was moving in the observation room beyond the glass. A dark shape, indistinct but unmistakably human in proportion, pressed against the frosted window. Then another beside it. And another. I counted 7 shapes in total, their features obscured by the frost but their outlines clear, 7 figures standing perfectly still, facing me. One raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. The frost melted beneath its palm, leaving a clear handprint, too long, the fingers too thin and jointed to be entirely human. I stumbled backward, knocking into the tape machine. The static changed pitch, becoming a high, keening wail that made my teeth vibrate. The frost on the window began to melt in earnest now, revealing what stood behind it. They weren't people, not anymore. Their forms were human-shaped voids, darker than the darkness around them, with only the vaguest suggestions of facial features. But I could feel them looking at me, their attention and almost physical pressure against my skin. The handprint on the glass began to steam, the outline glowing faintly as if heating from within. Then, impossibly, the hand began to push through the solid glass, the material rippling like water around the elongated fingers. I scrambled away, backing into the door, clawing at the handle that still refused to turn. The voices from the tape machine had changed again, now all speaking in unison. The echoes remember us. The echoes preserve us. The echoes will free us. The hand was halfway through the glass now, reaching toward me with deliberate slowness. The air around it shimmered, distorting like a heat mirage. In desperation, I threw my weight against the door. It held firm for one terrible moment, then suddenly gave way, sending me sprawling into the corridor. I didn't hesitate. I ran, no longer caring what it might provoke. Behind me, I heard the observation room window shatter, followed by the soft patter of footsteps. Not the heavy tread of solid bodies, but something lighter, as if whatever pursued me didn't quite conform to the laws of physics. The corridor ahead split into a T-junction. I veered right without thinking, then left at the next intersection, my only goal to put as much distance as possible between myself and room 321. The hallways blurred together, each looking identical to the last. I was hopelessly lost now, but still I ran. I rounded another corner and skidded to a halt. Before me stretched a familiar sight, the corridor leading to the acoustic chamber. I had somehow circled back to where the nightmare began. The metal door of the chamber stood open, revealing only darkness beyond. But from within came the sound of tapping, no longer rhythmic but frantic, desperate. Dozens, maybe hundreds of impacts, like a crowd hammering to be let out. And beneath it all, a voice I recognized called my name. Maxwell's voice, strained with fear. "Help me. I'm trapped in here. Please." I stood paralyzed. Maxwell couldn't be here. He was back at the office, waiting for my photographs. This was a trick, a lure. But what if it wasn't? The darkness behind me rustled with approaching movement. The shapes from the observation room were coming, their not-quite footsteps growing louder. I was caught between them and whatever waited in the chamber. Making a split-second decision, I lunged for the stairwell door I now spotted to my left. It opened easily, too easily, as if inviting me to this particular escape route. But I had no choice. I took the stairs two at a time, desperate to reach the ground floor and the exit beyond. But as I descended, I realized with growing horror that the stairs continued far deeper than should be possible. I'd already gone down at least 5 flights, and still the stairwell stretched below me. Blackwell had only 4 floors. I should have reached the ground level by now. I paused, gasping for breath, and looked back up. The door I'd entered through was no longer visible, the stairwell extending upward into darkness as impossibly as it did downward. From somewhere below came the sound of a door opening, followed by the now familiar tapping. From above, the whisper of movement grew louder. I was caught between 2 unknowns, trapped in an impossible architecture that seemed determined to contain me. And as I stood there, undecided, the lights in the stairwell began to flicker, each momentary darkness lasting a little longer than the one before. In the brief illumination between blackouts, I caught glimpses of writing on the walls, messages scratched into the concrete. The echoes are hungry. They use our voices to call others. 23 years and still recording. The final blackout lasted nearly 30 seconds. When the lights reluctantly flickered back on, I was no longer alone in the stairwell. Standing on the landing below, looking up at me with hollow eyes, was a figure I recognized from the hospital's history, Dr. Lawrence Mercer, the lead researcher on the acoustic therapy program, who disappeared during the hospital's final days of operation. But his form was wrong somehow, flattened, two-dimensional, like a paper cutout of a man. And when he spoke, his lips didn't move. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We've been waiting for someone to hear us." Dr. Mercer's paper-thin form wavered before me, like a reflection in disturbed water. His features were both precise and wrong, too sharp in some places, blurred in others. Only his eyes remained in perfect focus, dark and hungry. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. The doctor's mouth stretched into what might have been a smile on a human face, but on his flattened visage it was merely a tear, a black line stretching too wide. To be heard, came the reply, echoing in the stairwell. To be remembered. To continue our work. I took a step backward, ascending one stair. What work? Sound never truly dies, Mercer said, his form flickering like a bad television signal. It diminishes, yes. Becomes too faint for crude human ears. But it remains, eternally traveling, eternally echoing. We found a way to amplify those lost sounds. To bring back voices from the past. He began to ascend the stairs, each movement jerky and unnatural, as if he were being manipulated by unseen strings. I continued backing up, maintaining the distance between us. But we discovered something else, he continued. Something magnificent. Something terrible. the voices weren't just recordings. They were preserved. Consciousness trapped in acoustic amber. And with the right frequency, the right amplification, you could bring them back, I finished, understanding dawning with horrific clarity. Mercer's grin widened impossibly further. Not just them. Us. Me. After the accident. The lights flickered again, and in that brief darkness, I saw the truth, Mercer's body hanging from the acoustic chamber ceiling, twisted and broken. Suicide, the official reports had claimed. But the vision suggested something else, something that had occurred during one of his experiments. When the lights returned, Mercer was closer, now only 3 steps below me. His form seemed more substantial, less like paper and more like flesh, flesh that hadn't seen the sun in 23 years. "We need new voices," he said, his own voice changing, multiplying into a chorus. New echoes to strengthen our own, to maintain our presence, to expand our reach. I turned and ran upward, no longer caring where the stairs led as long as it was away from him. The stairwell seemed to contract and expand with each step, the walls breathing like living tissue. The scratched messages became more frequent, more desperate. "Run while your voice is still your own. They take your echo first, then the rest." It's been 19 days and I can still hear myself screaming. I burst through another door and found myself in a long corridor lined with recording equipment, microphones hanging from the ceiling, speakers embedded in the walls, wires snaking across the floor like dormant serpents. But this wasn't a part of the original building. This was something new, something constructed by whatever entities now inhabited Blackwell. As I moved forward, the microphone swiveled to track my progress, like mechanical predators scenting prey. From the speakers came a gentle static, rising and falling like breath. At the end of the corridor stood a single door marked broadcasting. It was the only way forward. I approached it cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But to what? Mercer and his 2-dimensional companions were behind me, and the impossible stairwell below. At least this door offered something unknown, and unknown was better than the certainty of what pursued me. The door opened at my touch, revealing a circular room that was a smaller version of the acoustic chamber. But where that space had been designed to contain and direct sound, this one seemed built to harvest it. Microphones of varying sizes and designs covered every surface, walls, ceiling, floor. Some were ancient, dating back to the 1930s, while others were modern, digital. All were active, their indicator lights glowing red in the dimness. In the center of the room stood a chair, simple, wooden, bolted to the floor. Restraints hung from its arms. "Please, sit," came Mercer's voice from behind me, startling me so badly I stumbled into the room. We'd prepared everything. He stood in the doorway, more solid now, more real. Behind him crowded other figures, the shapes I'd seen in the observation room, but clearer now. Men and women in hospital gowns and staff uniforms, all bearing the same wrongness as Mercer, all watching me with the same hungry eyes. "Just a simple recording session," Mercer said, stepping into the room. The others followed, forming a circle around the chair. "We need your voice. Your unique acoustic signature. The sound that is uniquely you." "And then what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Then you join us. Help us find others. Help us expand our collection." "Collection of what?" "Souls?" Mercer tilted his head, the movement too fluid, too far to one side to be human. Such an imprecise term. We prefer acoustic imprints. The essence of a person, preserved in sound waves. Neither living nor dead, but echoing. I backed away from the chair, but the circle of entities closed in. Their movements were synchronized now, as if they'd become parts of a single organism. The microphones around the room swiveled in unison, pointing at me. "It doesn't hurt," said a woman to Mercer's right, a nurse, based on her uniform. But her voice was wrong, modulating between pitches, as if multiple people were speaking through her. "It's like falling asleep. Like becoming music." "I don't want to become music," I said, continuing to back away until I hit the wall. The microphones there shifted to avoid being crushed, moving like insects. "Everyone wants to be remembered," said another figure, an elderly man in a patient's gown. "To leave something behind. What better legacy than your voice, eternal, perfect?" Their logic was seductive in its simplicity. Wasn't this the fundamental human desire, to outlast death, to be preserved in some form? But as I looked at their flickering, not quite real forms, I saw the horror of their existence. Not life extended, but consciousness trapped, preserved like insects in amber, able to perceive but not truly experience. They were closing in, hands outstretched. I noticed now that their fingertips were blurred, as if vibrating at frequencies too rapid to see clearly. The air around them shimmered with distortion. "Just a few words," Mercer urged. "A simple phrase. A scream. Anything we can use to create your template." I pressed myself against the wall, searching desperately for escape. The door we entered through was now blocked by the advancing crowd. But behind me, I felt something give slightly, a section of wall that seemed less solid than it should be. I pushed against it, and to my astonishment, it yielded, not a wall at all, but a cleverly disguised door, designed to blend seamlessly with its surroundings. "Stop him." Mercer's voice rose, multiplying into dozens of overlapping commands. The entities lunged forward, their movements suddenly frantic, desperate. I shoved hard against the hidden door and fell through into darkness beyond. Landing painfully on my hands and knees, I scrambled forward, not daring to look back. Behind me, I heard the outraged howls of the entities, no longer human voices, but pure sound, wavelengths of fury and hunger. I found myself crawling through a narrow maintenance tunnel, pipes and electrical conduits running along its length. The metal was cold beneath my palms, and the air tasted of dust and copper. But it was real, tangibly, physically real in a way that much of what I'd experienced in the past hour had not been. The tunnel curved downward, then sharply to the left. I followed it blindly, using the walls to guide me, occasionally banging my shoulders against protruding pipes. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter, then stopped completely. After what felt like an eternity of crawling through the claustrophobic space, I saw light ahead, dim, bluish, but unmistakably real. I emerged into what appeared to be a control room of sorts, filled with ancient computer equipment and monitoring stations. Screens lined one wall, showing different areas of the hospital, the main entrance, corridors, patient rooms, and the acoustic chamber. Most displayed only static, but one showed the circular room I just escaped from. The entities milled about in apparent confusion, their forms less substantial now, flickering in and out of visibility like bad television reception. On another screen, I saw the hospital grounds from an exterior view, and with a surge of hope, recognized the main entrance. It was still daylight outside. The sun hadn't set yet. A control panel beneath the monitors was labeled with room numbers and functions. One button, larger than the others, was simply marked System Reset. Without hesitation, I pressed it. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Alarms blared throughout the building, and red emergency lights began to flash. On the screens, I watched as the entities in the circular room reacted with visible panic, their forms destabilizing further, breaking apart into visual static. Mercer looked directly at the camera, his face contorting with rage. He spoke, and though there was no audio on the feed, I could read his lips. "We are not finished." Then the screens went dark, one by one, until only the exterior view remained. In that final image, I saw the main doors of the hospital open now, bright daylight spilling into the shadowed interior. A way out. But first, I had to navigate back through the building, a building that had already proven it could change its layout at will, populated by entities that wanted to trap me here forever. The control room had only one exit, a door that led back into the main structure. I approached it cautiously, listening for any sound from beyond. Hearing nothing, I turned the handle and stepped into a corridor I didn't recognize. The emergency lights still flashed, bathing everything in pulses of crimson. The alarms had faded to a distant wail. The air felt charged, tense, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I oriented myself using the emergency exit signs, following them toward what I hoped was the main entrance. The corridors remained eerily empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, followed. Occasionally, I thought I heard the tapping sound resume, distant but persistent. As I rounded a corner, I came face to face with a figure I initially mistook for another entity, but this one was solid, real. A security guard, elderly but alert, his flashlight beam hitting me directly in the eyes. "What the hell are you doing in here?" he demanded. "Building's closed." "How'd you get past the gate?" I could have wept with relief at the sound of a normal human voice. "I'm a photographer," I explained hastily. "I had permission from Urban Exploration Monthly." I must have triggered some old alarm system. "I was just leaving." The guard frowned, clearly skeptical. "No one has permission to be in here. Place is condemned, has been for years. Dangerous structure." "I'm sorry, I'll go right now," I said, eager to escape this nightmare. He studied me for a moment, then sighed. "I'll escort you out. Don't want you setting off any more alarms or falling through any rotten floors." As we walked toward the exit, I fought the urge to run ahead of him. Each step felt like it might be my last chance at freedom, that any moment the building might reconfigure itself again, trapping me in its impossible geometry. "Been guarding this place long?" I asked, trying to sound casual. 15 years, he replied. "Never had much trouble. Occasional thrill seekers like yourself, but mostly quiet. Ever hear anything strange inside the building?" He glanced at me sharply. "What kind of strange?" "I don't know." Voices. Tapping. The guard was silent for several steps. Then, quietly, "Place has acoustics that play tricks. Line through the old ventilation system. Nothing to worry about." But there was something in his voice, a careful neutrality that suggested he'd heard more than he was willing to admit. We reached the main entrance, and I could see my car parked outside, exactly where I'd left it just hours ago. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the overgrown grounds. "Just one thing," the guard said as we reached the doorway. "Did you record anything while you were in there? Take any audio samples?" I thought of my camera, which had an audio recording function for video clips. "No," I lied. "Just photographs." He nodded, seemingly relieved. "Good. That's good. Best not to capture certain things." As I stepped outside, the guard remained in the doorway, not following me into the sunlight. I hurried to my car, fighting the irrational fear that if I looked back, he might not be there anymore, or worse, might have been replaced by Mercer's paper-thin form. Only when I was inside the vehicle with the engine running did I allow myself to look back at the building. The guard was gone, the main doors closed once more. Blackwell stood silent against the darkening sky, its windows reflecting the setting sun like dozens of watchful eyes. I drove away, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that place. But as I adjusted my rearview mirror, I noticed something that made my blood run cold, a small red light on my camera, which lay on the passenger seat. It was recording, and from its tiny speaker came the faint but unmistakable sound of tapping. I nearly drove off the road when I noticed the recording light. With trembling hands, I pulled over onto the shoulder and grabbed the camera, frantically searching for the power button. The red light continued to blink mockingly even after I switched it off, removed the battery, and ejected the memory card. No, 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 I muttered, tossing the camera onto the floor of the passenger side. The tapping continued, quieter now but still audible, a gentle, insistent rhythm that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. I rolled down the windows, letting the cool evening air flood the car, hoping it would clear my head. Had I actually encountered something supernatural in Blackwell, or was I experiencing some kind of psychotic break? Neither option was particularly comforting. My phone buzzed in my pocket, 5 missed calls from Maxwell. Of course it worked perfectly now that I was away from the building. I answered on the first ring of the 6th call. "Where the hell have you been?" Maxwell's voice was tense with irritation. "I've been trying to reach you for hours. Did you get the shots?" "Maxwell," I said, my voice shaking. "Something happened in there." "Something. I can't explain." There was a pause, followed by a sigh. "Look, if the place was too creepy or whatever, that's fine. But I needed those photos for tomorrow's deadline, and now I'm—" "Listen to me," I interrupted, an edge of desperation in my voice. "There's something wrong with that building. The acoustic chamber, the recordings they were making, they found a way to preserve consciousness in sound waves." Another pause, longer this time. "Are you drunk?" "I'm not," I stopped myself, hearing how unhinged I must sound. "No, I'm not drunk. Just shaken up. I'll send you what photos I have, but I'm not going back there. Not ever." "Fine, whatever. Just give me what you've got by 9 tomorrow morning." He hung up without waiting for a response. I tossed the phone onto the dashboard and leaned back in my seat, exhaling slowly. The tapping had stopped, at least temporarily. Maybe I had imagined it, a stress response to the admittedly creepy atmosphere of the abandoned hospital. The drive back to my apartment was mercifully uneventful. I kept the radio off, unwilling to risk hearing any unexpected voices or sounds emerging from the speakers. By the time I arrived home, the sun had fully set, and a thin crescent moon hung in the sky, offering minimal illumination. My apartment was exactly as I'd left it that morning, dishes in the sink, half-empty coffee mug on the counter, laptop open on the kitchen table. The normalcy was reassuring. I made a quick circuit of the rooms, turning on every light, checking closets and corners with a thoroughness that would have embarrassed me under normal circumstances. I dropped the camera's memory card on the table and headed straight for the shower, spending nearly 30 minutes under the scalding water, as if I could wash away the memory of Blackwell along with the day's sweat and dust. Afterward, wrapped in a bathrobe, I forced myself to eat something, a sandwich hastily assembled from what I could find in the refrigerator. Then, Steeling myself, I inserted the memory card into my laptop to review the photographs. The first dozen or so were exactly what I'd expect: exterior shots of the building, corridors, abandoned rooms with peeling paint and broken furniture. Nothing unusual, nothing that couldn't be explained by 2 decades of neglect. Then I reached the photos taken in and around the acoustic chamber. At first glance, they too seemed normal enough: the cylindrical room with its curved walls, the heavy metal door, the control booth with its ancient equipment. But as I looked closer, I noticed details I hadn't seen when taking the pictures. Shadows that didn't quite match the objects casting them. Faint, blurry shapes in doorways and corners. And in one photograph of the tape machine, a reflection in the chrome surface that couldn't possibly have been mine: too tall, too thin, the head at a strange angle. I zoomed in on this reflection, my heart rate accelerating. The figure was indistinct but unmistakably there, standing behind me when I took the photo, though I'd been alone in the room. Or thought I had been. The last file on the card wasn't a photograph, but an audio recording. I didn't remember activating the camera's audio function, but there it was, a 3-minute MP3 file timestamped during my time in the acoustic chamber. My finger hovered over the play button. Everything in me screamed not to listen, to delete the file unopened, to forget everything that had happened at Blackwell. But another part, the journalist, the seeker of truth, couldn't leave this mystery unexplored. I compromised by turning my laptop's volume to its lowest setting before pressing play. At first, there was only silence, punctuated by what might have been my own breathing. Then came the tapping, that same rhythmic pattern I heard throughout the building. It started softly, then grew louder, more insistent. And beneath it, almost imperceptible at first but gradually rising in volume, voices, murmuring, whispering, words indistinguishable but the tone unmistakably urgent. A conversation, or multiple conversations, happening just below the threshold of comprehension. I leaned closer to the laptop, straining to make out what was being said. The voices seemed to be growing clearer, as if they were approaching a microphone, or as if they were approaching me through the speakers. Then, abruptly, the tapping stopped. In the silence that followed, a single voice spoke with perfect clarity. "We know you're listening." I jerked away from the laptop, nearly knocking it off the table. The voice continued, calm and measured, Dr. Mercer's voice, unmistakable even through the tinny laptop speakers. Sound travels in waves. Waves can be captured, preserved, transmitted. What you're hearing isn't a recording in the traditional sense. It's a conduit. And now that you've opened it, the audio suddenly distorted, a high-pitched squeal that made me clap my hands over my ears. When it subsided, the tapping had resumed, but with a different quality, sharper, crisper, as if it were happening in the room with me rather than through the speakers. I slammed the laptop shut and backed away from the table. The tapping continued. It was coming from my walls. Tap, tap. Tap, tap. Tap, tap. Like knuckles rapping against the plaster. Like someone trying to get my attention. Like someone trying to get in. I whirled around, searching for the source, but it seemed to move first from the wall behind my desk, then from the one near the kitchen, then from the ceiling. Always just out of sight, always moving when my back was turned. "This isn't real," I said aloud, my voice pathetically small in the suddenly oppressive silence of my apartment. "This is stress. Or a hallucination. Or..." My phone rang, the sound so sudden and normal that I yelped in surprise. Maxwell's name flashed on the screen. I grabbed it like a lifeline. "Hello?" Static greeted me, followed by what sounded like Maxwell's voice, but distant, as if he were speaking from the bottom of a well. Got your message. Concerned. Are you need help? Maxwell? Can you hear me? There's something wrong with the connection. More static, then, coming over, stay there, don't. The call dropped. I stared at the phone, uncertain what to do. Had Maxwell really said he was coming over? And why? I hadn't left him any messages since our brief conversation after leaving Blackwell. The tapping had stopped again. In its place came a new sound, the gentle hiss of my stereo system turning on by itself, its power light glowing green in the corner of the living room. From its speakers came a sound I recognized instantly, the echoing acoustics of the chamber at Blackwell. And within that distinctive resonance, voices. Beautiful work today, Doctor. Subject 42 responded remarkably well to the frequency adjustments. Thank you, Nurse Elkins. I believe we've finally found the optimal range. The human consciousness seems particularly responsive to sounds between 35 and 40 hertz, just below the normal threshold of hearing. It was a conversation, clinical and mundane. But what chilled me was the perfect clarity, as if it had been recorded yesterday rather than 23 years ago. And the side effects? Asked the nurse's voice. Unfortunate but necessary, replied Mercer. We cannot create a vessel for consciousness without occasionally displacing the original occupant. The ethics committee will shut us down if they find out. The ethics committee won't find out, Mercer said, his voice hardening. And even if they did, they couldn't possibly understand the significance of what we've achieved. We're not just recording voices, Eleanor. We're preserving souls. Offering a form of immortality. At what cost, Lawrence? These patients trust us. Progress always requires sacrifice. The recording, if that's what it was, faded into static. I stood frozen in the middle of my living room, afraid to approach the stereo, afraid to turn it off. Because I knew, somehow, that this wasn't simply a replay of past events. This was a message sent across time and space, through sound waves that had never truly died. The static shaped itself into a new voice, one I recognized from the stairwell at Blackwell. The elderly patient. He's listening. I can feel him listening. Good, replied Mercer. The connection is stable. The conduit is open. What now, Doctor? This from the nurse, Elkins. Now we extend our reach. One consciousness at a time. He's just the beginning. The static built again, rising in pitch and volume until it was almost painful. And beneath it, I could hear something new, a subtle undertone, a frequency that seemed to vibrate not in my ears but in my bones, in my brainstem. It made my vision blur, my thoughts scatter. The room around me began to waver, its edges becoming less distinct. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like lungs. And in their surfaces, I could see shapes forming, impressions of faces, hands pressing outward as if testing the membrane between one reality and another. This wasn't a haunting in the traditional sense. This was something far more insidious, a technology that had evolved beyond its creator's understanding, a way of capturing human consciousness that had become a prison and a hunger all at once. And now it had followed me home. A knock at my apartment door jolted me back to reality. The stereo fell silent, the walls solidified, the strange frequency faded. I stood motionless, uncertain whether to answer. Hello, came a voice from the hallway. It's Maxwell. You asked me to come check on you? I hadn't asked him any such thing. But the voice was unmistakably his, the familiar irritable tone, the slight New Jersey accent he'd never fully shaken. Cautiously, I approached the door and peered through the peephole. Maxwell stood in the hallway, looking impatient and concerned in equal measure. "Come on, open up," he called. "I was in the middle of dinner when I got your message. Sounded like you were having some kind of breakdown." I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob. What exactly did my message say? There was a pause. "What do you mean?" "You called me, said you were hearing things, seeing things. Asked me to come over right away. Said it was an emergency. I had done no such thing. But then, who or what had? I'm going to call the police," I said through the door. "Just stay there." "Don't be ridiculous," Maxwell replied, his voice changing subtly, a slight echo entering it, a resonance that hadn't been there before. "You don't need the police. You need help understanding what's happening to you. I can explain everything." The doorknob began to turn beneath my hand, though I wasn't the one turning it. I backed away, watching in horror as the deadbolt slid open of its own accord. The door swung inward, revealing Maxwell, or something wearing Maxwell's appearance like an ill-fitting suit. His proportions were slightly wrong, his movements too fluid, too synchronized. And his eyes, they were Maxwell's in color and shape, but empty of the irritable intelligence I knew so well. Instead, they held the same hungry vacancy I'd seen in Mercer and the others. "We told you we weren't finished," said Maxwell's mouth, but the voice was Mercer's. "We've only just begun." I backed away as the thing that wasn't Maxwell stepped into my apartment. Behind him, in the hallway, I could see more figures approaching, my neighbors, the building superintendent, the woman from the coffee shop downstairs, all moving with the same wrong fluidity, all wearing the same empty expression. "Did you think distance would matter?" Not Maxwell asked, tilting his head at that impossible angle. "Sound travels. Waves propagate. And once we have a connection, even the briefest recording, the smallest sample, we can follow it back to its source." The others were entering now, filing into my apartment with synchronized movements. Their faces flickered occasionally, showing the entities beneath, the hollow-eyed patients and staff of Blackwell, using these new bodies as vessels, puppets to be manipulated. "Your voice is particularly resonant," Not Maxwell continued, advancing slowly. "A perfect acoustic signature. It will make an excellent addition to our collection." I retreated until my back hit the wall. There was nowhere left to go, no escape from the closing circle of possessed figures. In desperation, I lunged for my laptop, still sitting on the table where I'd left it. If sound was their medium, their conduit, if they traveled through recordings and transmissions, then perhaps there was a way to disrupt them, to break the connection. I threw open the laptop and frantically searched for audio editing software. Finding it, I began generating a counter-frequency, a cancellation wave that might disrupt whatever signal they were using to maintain their presence here. "Clever," said Not Maxwell, watching me with those vacant eyes. "But futile. We've had 23 years to perfect our methods. Your primitive attempt at interference won't." The high-pitched tone blasted from my laptop speakers, cutting him off mid-sentence. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Not Maxwell's form shuddered, his outline blurring like a television with poor reception. The others reacted similarly, their movements becoming jerky, uncoordinated. "Stop," Not Maxwell's voice distorted, breaking apart into fragments. "You don't understand what you're—" I increased the volume, pushing it to maximum. The sound was painfully loud, but I endured it, watching as the entities struggled against its effects. Their borrowed forms began to malfunction, limbs twitching independently, faces contorting in impossible ways. Not Maxwell reached for me, his movements now robotic, disjointed. We offer immortality. I don't want your kind of immortality, I shouted over the noise. I don't want to be berserk in your acoustic amber. I want to live, actually live. His hand closed around my wrist, and I felt a strange vibration pass through the point of contact, a frequency that resonated with my bones, my blood, my thoughts. For a moment, I glimpsed what they were offering, consciousness extended indefinitely, free from the restraints of mortal flesh, existing as pure information, pure sound. It was seductive in its way, a form of life after death, a persistence beyond the physical. But as the vision deepened, I saw the truth of their existence, the hunger that drove them, the emptiness at their core. They weren't truly alive, but neither were they dead. They were echoes, endlessly repeating, endlessly hungry for more voices to join their chorus. With my free hand, I adjusted the frequency on my laptop, finding the exact counterwave to the vibration passing through not Maxwell's touch. The effect was immediate. He recoiled as if burned, his borrowed form glitching more severely. You cannot escape us. The words came not from one mouth, but from all of them simultaneously, a chorus of stolen voices. We are in the sound waves all around you. They were right. In a world filled with speakers, microphones, recording devices, how could I possibly escape them now that they'd found me, now that they had my acoustic signature? But then I realized they hadn't fully captured me yet. They have recordings, samples, but not the complete pattern they needed to create a template of my consciousness. That's what they needed me for. That's why they followed me here. You don't have me yet, I said, continuing to back away, moving toward my bedroom. And you never will. We have patience, they responded in that terribly unified voice. We have time. I slammed the bedroom door and locked it, knowing it wouldn't hold them for long, but needing just a few moments to implement the desperate plan forming in my mind. If they traveled through sound, existed in sound, needed sound to maintain their presence in this world, then the answer was simple. Silence. Not just quiet, but true acoustic isolation. I grabbed my noise-canceling headphones, the expensive ones I used for editing audio at work, and my phone. From the other side of the door came scraping sounds as they began to force their way in. Working quickly, I generated a complex noise-canceling pattern on my phone, a signal designed to counter all ambient sound around me. I put on the headphones, took a deep breath, and activated the program. The effect was immediate and disorienting, a vacuum of sound so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. The world around me continued, but I experienced it in perfect, absolute silence. The door burst open. Not Maxwell and the others entered, their mouths moving in what must have been threats or persuasions, but I heard nothing. Their forms seemed less substantial now, flickering more rapidly between their borrowed appearances and their true nature. They approached me, reaching out with those two fluid hands, but as they came close, something strange happened. They seemed unable to touch me, as if repelled by some invisible force field. The noise-canceling field around me was disrupting their ability to interact with the physical world. I stood my ground, maintaining the silence around me. One by one, they began to fade, first becoming transparent, then dissolving into static-like patterns, and finally disappearing altogether. All except not Maxwell, who remained, though barely visible now, like a heat mirage on asphalt. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear but could still read on his lips. We will be waiting. In every recording. In every broadcast. In every echo. until you listen again." Then he too dissolved, leaving me alone in my bedroom, wrapped in my bubble of manufactured silence, surrounded by the everyday objects of my normal life that now seemed fragile, temporary, precious in their mundane reality. I didn't know how long this solution would last. I didn't know if I could maintain this acoustic isolation indefinitely. But for now, at least, I had found a defense against the echoes. As I stood there in my silent sanctuary, I realized with grim certainty that I could never again listen to a recording, never again use a phone, never again hear anything that wasn't directly, acoustically present in the room with me. Because they were out there now, waiting in the sound waves. The echoes that never truly died. The ghosts in the frequencies. Waiting for me to listen just one more time. 3 weeks passed in self-imposed acoustic isolation. I wore my noise-canceling headphones every moment I was alone, generating counter-frequencies through specially programmed apps. When forced to interact with others, buying groceries, making necessary appearances at work, I used discrete earbuds that filtered all electronic sound, allowing only direct acoustic vibrations to reach me. I had not heard a recorded voice, a digital sound, or an electronic tone in 21 days. I watched television with subtitles. I disabled all speakers in my apartment. I put my phone on permanent vibrate. The practical difficulties of this existence were considerable, but not as great as the isolation. Human connection becomes strained when you can't answer a phone call, listen to a voicemail, or engage with any media involving recorded sound. Friends stopped calling. Maxwell put me on indefinite leave after I refused to edit audio for a photo essay. My life contracted to a small, controlled space where I could monitor every sound that reached my ears. Was I being paranoid? Perhaps. But the alternative, risking those entities finding me again, was unthinkable. On the 22nd day of my new existence, a letter arrived in my mailbox. Not an email, not a text message, but an actual paper letter in an envelope. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message printed in plain black text. They find other ways to reach you when you close your ears. They use your eyes, your skin, your thoughts. There is no escape from the frequency room 321. Blackwell Institute, come along, come soon. I can help you break the connection. It was unsigned. I read it standing in my kitchen, my hands trembling slightly. Return to Blackwell? It seemed insane. And yet, the message confirmed what I'd begun to fear, that my acoustic isolation was a temporary measure at best, that these entities would find other vectors to reach me. I'd noticed strange phenomena over the past few days, words rearranging themselves on pages I was reading, screens flickering to show images of the acoustic chamber, vibrations coming through the walls that I could feel but not hear. They were adapting, finding new channels. I spent 3 days considering the letter, turning it over in my mind, examining it for any clue to its authenticity or origin. It could be a trap, of course. Mercer and the others luring me back to complete what they had started. But it could also be genuine, perhaps from the security guard, who seemed to know more than he'd admitted, or from someone else who encountered these entities and found a way to counter them. In the end, my decision came down to a simple reality. I couldn't live like this forever. No human could maintain total acoustic isolation indefinitely. I needed a permanent solution, not just a defensive measure. I returned to Blackwell on a Tuesday morning, deliberately choosing daylight hours. The building looked different in the harsh light of a cloudless day, less mysterious, more simply derelict. Paint peeling from concrete. Broken windows like missing teeth. The grand institutional architecture reduced to a hollow shell. There was no sign of the security guard. The main gate stood open, chain and padlock lying broken on the ground. I approached cautiously, wearing my noise-canceling headphones, a Faraday pouch containing my switched-off phone in my pocket. I'd come prepared this time, flashlights, compass, chalk to mark my path, even food and water in case I became trapped. The front entrance was unlocked, the door slightly ajar as if someone had recently entered. I pushed it open and stepped into the familiar lobby, sunlight streaming through dusty windows, illuminating floating motes of dust and golden beams. Everything seemed normal, or as normal as an abandoned psychiatric hospital could be. No impossible architecture. No shifting corridors. No voices or tapping sounds penetrated my headphones' isolation. I made my way up the main staircase, marking each junction with chalk arrows pointing back toward the exit. The building's layout remained consistent, matching the floor plan I'd studied before my first visit. This was both reassuring and unsettling. Had my previous experience been simply a hallucination? Some kind of psychotic break triggered by the admittedly eerie atmosphere? But the letter had been real. The strange phenomena in my apartment had been real. And the recordings, those had been real too. I reached the third floor and followed the corridor to room 321, the recording room where I first heard the voices on the ancient tape machines. The door was closed but unlocked. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was exactly as I remembered it, recording equipment along one wall, control panel opposite, observation window looking into another room. But there was one new addition, a person sitting in the wooden chair in the center of the room, back to the door. I approached cautiously, pulse accelerating. As I drew nearer, the figure turned, and I found myself looking at a woman in her 60s, with short gray hair and alert, intelligent eyes. She wore the uniform of a nurse, but faded and worn as if it had been used daily for decades. She smiled when she saw me, a thin, tired expression that didn't reach her eyes. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear through my headphones. I hesitated, then slowly removed them, ready to replace them at the first sign of the entities. "Been expecting you," she was saying. "Though I wasn't sure you'd come." "Who are you?" I asked, keeping my distance. "My name is Eleanor Elkins. I was a nurse here during Mercer's experiments." She gestured to the chair opposite her. "Please, sit. We don't have much time." The name struck me immediately, Nurse Elkins from the recordings, who had questioned Mercer's ethics. I remained standing. "How do I know you're not one of them? The entities using someone else's form?" She nodded, as if she'd expected this question. A reasonable concern. "But those entities, as you call them, can't manifest physically during daylight hours without a direct audio connection to their target. They're weakest when the sun is highest." She checked her watch. "Which gives us approximately 3 hours before they regain enough strength to return." "Return from where?" "From the frequency they inhabit. The space between sounds, between vibrations." She sighed. "It's complicated physics, and we don't have time for the full explanation. What matters is that I can help you break their connection to you permanently." I wanted to believe her, but caution made me ask, "How did you escape them? If you were there during the experiments?" "I wasn't one of Mercer's victims, if that's what you're asking. I was the one who tried to stop him." Her expression darkened. "When I realized what he was doing, using patients as test subjects, trying to preserve consciousness in sound waves, I attempted to shut the program down. But it was too late. He'd already begun the transformation process on himself. He committed suicide, I said, remembering the vision I'd seen in the stairwell. She shook her head. Not exactly. He transferred his consciousness deliberately. The hanging was staged afterward. By then, he existed primarily in the acoustic field he created. His physical death was merely a formality. I finally took the seat opposite her, my curiosity overcoming my caution. But how are you still here? Still alive? That was 23 years ago. I've been hiding, moving frequently, using technology to mask my acoustic signature. She gestured to a device on the floor beside her, something that looked homemade, a tangle of wires and circuits connected to what appeared to be small speakers. I've developed countermeasures over the years. Ways to disrupt their signals, block their frequencies. Like my noise-canceling headphones. Similar principle, but more sophisticated. Your method is defensive, mine is offensive. It doesn't just block them, it breaks their hold on this plane entirely. And you can use it to help me? Break their connection to me? Yes. She leaned forward. But there's a cost. There's always a cost when dealing with these fundamental forces. What cost? Her eyes met mine, steady and grave. Your voice. I stared at her, uncomprehending. My voice? To permanently break their connection to you, we have to eliminate what they're connected to, your unique acoustic signature. The sound pattern that makes your voice distinctly yours. You mean I won't be able to speak ever again? You'll be able to make sounds. But your voice as it exists now, its particular timbre, resonance, pattern, that will be gone. Altered beyond recognition. Even to human ears, you'll sound different. I sat back, trying to process this. My voice, my literal voice in the world, in exchange for freedom from these entities. It seemed an impossible choice. There's no other way? I asked. None that I've found in 23 years of searching. She gestured to the equipment around us. Mercer found something fundamental about the nature of sound and consciousness. Something that can't be undone, only countered or avoided. The choice, ultimately, is yours. Live in isolation, constantly defending against their incursions. Or sacrifice your voice to be truly free of them. I considered it, weighing the options. My voice was my instrument as a journalist, my primary tool for human connection. But what good was a voice if I could never use electronic communication again? If I had to live in fear of every speaker, every microphone, every recording device? How does it work? I finally asked. We use Mercer's own technology against him. She stood and moved to the control panel, flipping switches, adjusting dials. This room, this entire building, was designed for acoustic manipulation. We can generate a cancellation wave specific to your voice pattern, effectively erasing it from the frequency spectrum they inhabit. Will it hurt? She paused, her hand on a large red lever. Yes. Changing something so fundamental to your identity always does. The equipment around the room hummed to life, lights flickering on control panels that should have been long dead. The air seemed to thicken, pressure building as if before a storm. Make your choice, Eleanor said. We have maybe 10 minutes before they sense the equipment activating and come to investigate. I thought of my life before Blackwell, normal, predictable, safe. I thought of the past 3 weeks, isolated, constrained, constantly vigilant. And I thought of a future spent in that state, forever separated from the full range of human experience by my fear of what waited in the sound waves. "Do it," I said. Eleanor nodded and threw the switch. The room filled with a sound I can only describe as the auditory equivalent of a black hole, a negative space that seemed to draw all other sound into it, a vacuum that pulled at my ears, my throat, my chest. I opened my mouth to scream, but the sound that emerged wasn't mine. It wasn't anyone's. It was fractured, discordant, wrong in a way that made my skin crawl. The observation window shattered inward, and through it came the entities, led by Mercer's paper-thin form, followed by the others, no longer bothering with human disguises but moving as their true selves, visual distortions in the fabric of reality. "Stop!" Mercer's voice boomed, no longer just in my ears, but somehow inside my skull. "You don't understand what you're destroying." Eleanor stood firm at the control panel, her hand steady on the lever. "I understand perfectly, Lawrence. I understand what you became, what you made others become." The entities surged forward, but couldn't seem to cross an invisible threshold around the equipment. They clawed at the air, their forms distorting further, breaking apart and reforming. "We offer immortality," Mercer insisted, his voice now multiplied, a chorus of stolen identities. "Existence beyond physical constraints." "You offer a prison," Eleanor responded calmly. "A half-life. An echo." The sound intensified, focusing now on me. I felt something fundamental shifting, changing, as if the atomic structure of my vocal cords was being rewritten. The pain was extraordinary, a burning sensation that spread from my throat throughout my entire body. The entities became more frantic, their movements more erratic. They began to flicker like faulty light bulbs, their coherence failing. "You belong with US." Mercer's form lunged toward me, passing through the invisible barrier through sheer will. His paper-thin hand closed around my throat. "Your voice is ours." I tried to scream again, but what emerged was no longer recognizable as human sound. It was something else, something that seemed to exist in multiple frequencies simultaneously, layered in ways that hurt the mind to contemplate. Mercer recoiled as if burned. His form began to disintegrate, breaking apart into visual static. The other entities followed suit, their bodies dissolving, returning to whatever frequency they normally inhabited. "What have you done?" Mercer's voice was fading, no longer the overwhelming presence it had been, but diminishing with each word. Eleanor answered for me, set him free. And perhaps, in a way, set you free too. With a final sound like radio static, the entities vanished completely. The equipment around us powered down, the lights on the control panel fading to darkness. The pressure in the room normalized, the air becoming ordinary again. I slumped in the chair, exhausted beyond words. My throat felt raw, transformed, alien to me now. Eleanor approached, her expression a mixture of sympathy and satisfaction. "Try to speak." I opened my mouth, uncertain what would emerge. The sound that came out was difficult to describe. Not inhuman, exactly, but fundamentally altered. Multiple tones overlapping. Harmonics that shouldn't be possible from a human larynx. A voice that existed in several acoustic dimensions at once. "What did you do to me?" I tried to ask, the words barely recognizable through the strange, multi-layered sounds. "Gave you a voice they can't use. Can't capture. Can't imitate." She smiled sadly. "They exist in conventional acoustic patterns. Your voice now exists outside those patterns. It's like a color they can't see, a frequency they can't access." But no one will understand me, I said, hearing the alien quality of my new voice with growing horror. People will adapt. The human ear is remarkably flexible. She began packing up her homemade device. And there are therapies that can help you develop more conventional speech patterns over time. It won't be the same, but it will be functional. You've done this before. To others. She paused, then nodded. 7 others over the years. People who encountered Mercer's work became targets. It was the only way to free them. And yourself? Eleanor's smile turned bitter. I modified my own voice years ago. The first and worst job. I barely knew what I was doing. I noticed then what I hadn't before, the strange harmonics in her speech, subtle but present if you listen closely. Not as dramatic as my new voice, but definitely altered. What now? I asked. Now you live your life. Free from them, free from hiding. She handed me a card with a phone number. This therapist specializes in unusual speech disorders. She knows enough of the truth to help without asking too many questions. She began walking toward the door. I called after her, or tried to, my new voice still shocking to my own ears. Will they come back? Find another way? Eleanor paused at the threshold. No, not to you. Your acoustic signature is permanently altered. You're invisible to them now. She looked back, her expression grave. But they're still out there. Still searching for new voices. New carriers. Shouldn't we warn people? Tell them about this? With what evidence? Who would believe us? She shook her head. All we can do is help those who find themselves targeted, one person at a time. And with that, she was gone, leaving me alone in the room where everything had begun. I made my way out of Blackwell for the last time, emerging into the bright afternoon sunlight. The building behind me seemed smaller somehow, less imposing. Just an abandoned structure, slowly crumbling back into the earth. My new voice might prevent me from returning to my old life as a journalist. But as I walked to my car, I realized it also offered something I hadn't expected, a kind of freedom. I no longer needed to fear recordings, transmissions, broadcasts. I could listen to music again, use a phone, live in the modern world without constant vigilance. The trade seemed fair in that light. My voice for my life. As I drove away, I switched on the car radio for the first time in weeks. Music filled the car, ordinary, harmless music. No whispers beneath the melodies. No tapping behind the rhythms. Just sound, pure and simple. In the rearview mirror, Blackwell receded into the distance. For a moment, I thought I saw figures standing at the windows, paper-thin silhouettes watching my departure. But when I looked again, there was nothing but empty frames and peeling paint. Nothing but an abandoned building, housing echoes that would never truly die, but could no longer reach me. I opened my mouth and sang along to the radio with my new, impossible voice, a voice that existed in frequencies beyond the reach of ghosts. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.